Good afternoon, everyone. And the first item of business today is an Equal Opportunities Committee debate on where Gypsy travellers live. And invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now. And I call on Margaret McCulloch to open the debate on behalf of the committee. Minister, 14 minutes, please. A precise 14 minutes today, please.
As a member of the Equal Opportunities Committee for less than a day, I unfortunately was not involved in the work we're here to discuss, but I do have before me two compelling and insightful reports that have left me eager to take the helm over the coming months. The committee's inquiries into Gypsy travellers and care and where Gypsy travellers live, published in September last year and March this year, have raised some clear concerns about whether the Scottish Government, local authorities and health providers are making due provision for one of Scotland's traditional yet marginalised communities. Before I introduce the reports and speak about the recommendations made, I'd like to extend my thanks to my new colleagues and former committee members who worked on the inquiry. My particular thanks go to Mary Fee, who oversaw both inquiries in her time as convener of the committee. The strong recommendations made in both reports are a clear sign of both the committee's engagement in the inquiries and the urgent need for action. Throughout their inquiries, the committee worked closely with both Gypsy travellers and organisations who support them. Without the help of MECOP, an Edinburgh-based voluntary organisation who work with carers from Black and ethnic minority communities, much of the committee's engagement work would not have been possible. Through MECOP, the committee were able to attend an awareness-raising session with Gypsy travellers, invite Gypsy travellers into the Parliament on a number of occasions and visit multiple sites across Scotland. When exploring issues in the North East region, the Grampian Regional Equality Council provided invaluable support and helped to set up the first ever committee meeting to be held on a Gypsy traveller site. The other voluntary organisations, health workers and liaison officers who contributed helped to give a clear insight into how joint working and involving Gypsy travellers in forward planning can lead to successful initiatives, providing a base for many of the committee's recommendations. Of course, perhaps the greatest contribution to the two inquiries came from Gypsy travelling people themselves. I was pleased to see in reading the reports that a clear relationship between the committee and the Gypsy travelling people they met has been formed. Given the emphasis placed by Gypsy travellers and support workers on the need for trust, this provides a clear starting point in beginning to implement the recommendations made. One of the aims of the committee was to instigate action. Though numerous reports and recommendations have been made in the past, including a report by the 2001 Equal Opportunities Committee, the Gypsy travelling community have experienced few positive changes. By talking to the committee, sharing their views and experiences, both in evidence and informally, coming to the Parliament and inviting committee members into their own homes, the Gypsy travelling people the committee met helped to make sure their voice was heard. This, I hope, will set a precedent for the Scottish Government and its agencies in moving forward. The committee's first report, Gypsy Travellers and Care, explored the relationship between Gypsy travellers and their access to health and care services. For Gypsy travellers that travel, there can be clear barriers to accessing healthcare and education and consistent support and funding. Those living on permanent sites face challenges in securing appropriate adaptations, and cultural differences can mean that certain support options, such as respite care, are not delivered appropriately. In recommendations, the committee focused on ensuring that all Gypsy travellers had access to general health care and more specific support as needed. There was an emphasis on ensuring that support and treatment is culturally appropriate and that both care and funding for care is accessible and portable. The Scottish Government's response left much in the hands of the NHS Health Scotland, Education Scotland and local authorities. I hope to hear some reassurances today that the buck doesn't stop there. They also spoke of the revision of the GP registration form and adaptations working group, and the relevance of both the Children and Young People Bill and the Social Care Self-Directed Support Bill. An update in progress and how provisions are being put into action would, I'm sure, be welcomed by the committee. In their Where Gypsy Travellers Live report, the committee shifted focus to the living conditions of gypsy travellers and were able to visit 7 sites over the course of the inquiry. The descriptions of site conditions in the report say it all. I quote, "We were deeply disturbed to see that families paying rent to their local council were expected to bathe young children in freezing cold amenity blocks with extortionate heating costs, and the elderly and disabled people might have to go outside to a toilet block in the middle of a cold winter's night. At one site, as well as a putrid overflowing septic tank and a fire hose that couldn't reach all of the pitches, we heard that with no bus stops or roadside pavement, the only way for non-driving families to visit local shops or take children to use a playground was to walk 2 miles to the nearest town along a muddy, unlit woodland path. Another site was barely lit at night, with appalling and tokenistic attempts to make adaptations for a profoundly disabled resident, and sightings of prowlers in the woods, which provided the only place for children to play. We even felt the fear ourselves of being able to safely access one site up a steep, potholed and gravel path, only able to imagine the danger it could present in icy winter. Disturbingly, this site was lacking in either a fixed phone line or stable mobile phone signal, leaving residents with medical conditions unable to easily seek emergency care. Presiding Officer, this description is all the more shocking when you realise that the majority of these sites are council operated, with rental rates not dissimilar to standard social housing, and tenants paying standard council tax rates, despite the fact that many are paying purely for a pitch and an amenity unit. Recommendations within the report aimed at creating equality within the standard of living for gypsy travellers through the establishment of minimum standards for a site quality, established and consistent rights for site tenants through tenancy agreements, and adequate provision of both temporary and permanent sites across the country. One thing that stands out in both reports is that the fact that those outside the gypsy travelling community have little understanding of their culture and the challenges they face in maintaining their traditional lifestyle. Quite shockingly, the committee heard of gypsy travellers hiding their cultural heritage for fear of not receiving medical treatment, being harassed or not being able to find employment. Both reports highlight a lack of leadership at local, regional and national level and urge the Scottish Government to set an example through clear guidelines and zero-tolerance approach to discrimination, including the development of a national awareness-raising campaign. The response from the Government to Where Gypsy Travellers Live set out details of a new cross-government group designed to take forward the recommendations made by the 2 reports in the aim of meeting their equality outcome that gypsy travellers experience less discrimination and more positive attitudes towards their cultural and way of life by 2017. Before the summer recess, the committee wrote to the Scottish Government concerning their response, raising concerns that whilst the Government seemed to be in agreement with many of the findings of the report, there was a lack of action. This sadly reflects the committee's concerns that there is a lack of leadership at ministerial level. As the new convener, I hope to hear more on that today, and going forward, we'll be looking for evidence, a tangible action plan with clear goals and, more importantly, clear results. The committee also made strong recommendations aimed at COSLA within both reports, raising the need for stronger leadership and consistency between local authorities. I'm relieved to see that both COSLA and the Scottish Government have highlighted their intention to work together, but again, that intention must become action. I've not got long to go. Can I continue? Sorry. Since the publication of both reports, the committee have revisited progress and received updates from the support organisations involved. I'm pleased to hear that both MECOP through the Scottish Government and Grampian Regional Equality Council through the National Lottery have received further funding for their work, and that NHS staff in Grampian are exploring a new joint approach to health engagement with gypsy travellers. I am concerned, however, to hear of an ongoing issues in planning for new sites in the North East. It's clear that political leadership is needed in tackling the negative attitudes that present a barrier to such a development. The committee's goals in bringing about real and desperately needed improvements to life of gypsy travellers are the standout feature of both reports. And to that end, they have agreed to revisit the recommendations of the report as time passes. We will be expecting regular updates from the Scottish Government, and I hope to see in the near future the development of a clear action plan emerging from the work of the cross-government working group. It is crucial that this is a timeline, an assurance of consultation with gypsy travellers and other stakeholders, and measurable outcomes. We hope as well to continue to monitor progress by keeping in touch with not only MECOP and Grampian Regional Equality Council, but also the gypsy travellers who contributed to both inquiries. Finally, Presiding Officer, let me say that I look forward, as convener, to leading the ongoing work of the committee and to hearing and seeing for myself the improvements that the Scottish Government and local authorities have in their power to bring about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And my apologies to the Chamber, Margaret McCulloch and Margaret Burgess, for confusing the running order and positions of the opening speakers. I now call on Minister Margaret Burgess. 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'll start by welcoming Margaret McCulloch to her new role as Chair of the Equal Opportunities Committee, and clearly it's something she's one meeting and to come to this debate, but very much congratulations on your Chair of Equal Opportunities. And I'm pleased to have the opportunity to provide the opening remarks on behalf of the Scottish Government, and I'd thank the committee for carrying out the inquiry and producing their report. And I would also like to thank everyone who gave to the committee the evidence which has helped shape that report. And I'm sure during the debate we've already heard some of the examples of the way in which the gypsy traveller community continue to be disenfranchised and discriminated against. And these are rightly considered some of the most troubling aspects of life in Scotland today and are not part of the country that we aspire to be. So it's right that we consider the challenges and the barriers faced every day by the gypsy traveller community, but not just in the debate this afternoon, but as part of the work we undertake to do every day for all of the communities we represent. Because the gypsy traveller community has made and continues to make a significant contribution to the life of our nation. We believe in the importance of eliminating racism and racial discrimination against this community. And make no mistake, we know that gypsy traveller groups are subject to widespread levels of prejudice, discrimination and abuse. They have a limited voice and influence in the public policies which affect them and often have difficulty in accessing services appropriate for their needs. This results in much poorer education and health outcomes than other communities. In fact, it was a consideration of these multiple poorer outcomes which helped the Scottish Government's recently published Public Sector Equality Duty Outcomes, one of which we will specifically address the inequalities currently experienced by so many members of the gypsy traveller community. In it, we have committed to working with gypsy travellers and with other stakeholders to determine the best way to raise awareness and improve understanding, and in that way foster good relations between gypsy travellers and settled communities. In addition, working with communities, we will also explore to explore and build more sustainable means of engagement which take account of Gypsy travellers' culture and transient lifestyle. We will review the relevant existing data sources we hold across a range of public domains and identify evidence gaps, and this work will inform our evidence requirements and plans moving forward. We intend to carry out this work through a cross-government group in order to ensure that all policy interests are taken into account. The same group considered the recommendations from the Gypsy Traveller and Care and the Where Gypsy Travellers Live inquiry and is in the process of putting into action, and I stress action, the commitments we made. In taking this forward, we know that we need to see real tangible improvements in the lives of a community who have for so long felt ignored. I'll take an intervention.
John Finney.
Thank you. I'm grateful for the Minister accepting an intervention. If this is the action that follows on from these two reports, Minister, and you're acknowledging there's been deficiencies, what was happening on the part of the Government prior to receipt of both these reports?
Minister.
The Government has always been looking at the issues surrounding Gypsy travellers, and in particular where Gypsy travellers live. It's part of what the housing regulator now looks at, the accommodation that's going to be provided for Gypsy travellers, and we'll be looking at that in terms of the care. We have made improvements in care for Gypsy travellers. We've also set up a number of groups looking across the portfolios, because as the member will well know, there are very complex issues surrounding the Gypsy traveller community, and we want to get it right. But I think, as has rightly been identified, one of the very first things we have to do is raise the awareness and ensure that the settled community and Gypsy traveller community can work together and live together in harmony. And I think that's important, and it's not something that's been put on the back seat and ignored. That's constantly been looked at and under discussion, and we've brought the committee together again, and we've welcomed the reports and evidence of the committee, and that's what's informing how we're going to take it forward. But we're talking, as I talked earlier about the discrimination, if it was any other ethnic minority group, it would be totally unacceptable. So we've started exploring how to deliver an awareness-raising campaign which will endeavour to change the perception and prejudice which are still sadly associated with the community. And during the evidence session, I was asked if I would support such a campaign, and I said I would. I think a campaign like that has merit. And following the committee's report, officials have had discussions with Amnesty International, who also have stated their support for such a campaign. But for this campaign to be successful, we've got to include all stakeholders, including the Gypsy traveller community as well, if we want to make this campaign a success. So we look forward to engaging with them in producing and delivering a campaign. We know that it's vital. I'll give way.
John Mason.
I wonder if the Minister could give us any timescale as to when the campaign might start?
Minister.
No, I'm announcing that today, and we're in discussion with it, and we will certainly keep the member involved, but it will be certainly one of the first things that the group that we've set up will look at. We're making certain commitments today, and that's one of the things that the group will look at, and I would hope it's done fairly quickly, but I'm not going to put a timescale on it and then somebody come back and tell me we've missed the time. But it's something we're keen to do, and keen to do as quickly as possible. We know that it's vital we take this opportunity to tackle the entrenched attitudes which are still prevalent. It's important, that it's about getting it right, it's about getting the campaign right to ensure that we can build in good relationships and better understanding between settled communities and the Gypsy traveller community. But responsibility is, of course, a two-way street, and service providers and the settled community undoubtedly do have to do more to understand and respond appropriately to Gypsy traveller communities. However, Gypsy traveller communities also have responsibilities, and they must make sure that living in accordance with their traditional practices does not adversely impact on others. And I have stressed throughout this contribution, and also when I gave evidence to the committee.
Dennis Robertson.
Thank you. I thank the Minister for taking a brief intervention. Would the Minister acknowledge that if there are inadequate sites for Gypsy travellers to live, they sometimes have no alternative to go to unauthorised sites?
Minister.
Yeah, I'll touch on that shortly, Mr Robertson, and also that it doesn't take away the responsibility aspect. I didn't suggest that living in an unauthorised site was absolutely a lack of responsibility. I'm suggesting there are responsibilities attached to all communities that shouldn't impact on others, and I will come back to unauthorised sites shortly. But we have to look at how to remove the barriers, and we can only do it if there is that better understanding. We know that many of the issues arising in local communities are of a very sensitive nature, and this comes with the need to balance the rights of the gypsy traveller population to follow their traditional way of life and the rights of local communities to pursue theirs. And one area where we need to balance different rights is particularly highlighted, as was mentioned by Dennis Robertson, in relation to unauthorised sites. We're very keen that the group examine the rights and responsibilities in relation to sites authorised and unauthorised, and we'll invite representatives from local authorities, COSLA and the Gypsy Traveller community and other stakeholders to be in this group to look at this in depth and try and get this matter resolved, but it is about rights and responsibilities. The group will look into the issues around the quality of some of the local authority sites, and I absolutely agree that some of the cases that was outlined by Margaret McCulloch at the start of this debate were absolutely shocking, and none of us want to see that, and absolutely recognise that local authority sites, that the residents on those sites do pay for the rent and are entitled to get services for that, and I think that is something that we will be looking at. No one in Scotland should have poor living conditions, and as part of the work of the group, we'll be looking at doing that and looking also at including the option of issuing updated guidance to local authorities. We'll also explore the development and implementation of a standard Gypsy Traveller site tenancy agreement with set minimum responsibilities and rights. And this is something we need to explore fully with all the interested stakeholders before we can get a decision on the best way forward. But any agreement should be about rights and responsibilities of all concerned. It should be clear to gypsy travellers when they're on a site what services they should expect from the landlord and what they should do if those services are not being delivered. And I would want to see that clearly in any tenancy or leasing agreement. We achieved success previously with the work of the North East Working Party, chaired by the then Housing and Communities Minister Alex Neil. And this brought together a wide range of stakeholders and produced a strategy with practical steps to improve and sustain community relations in the North East. We will follow up on the implementation of this strategy to see how its actions have been put into practice and establish what lessons have been learned and that we can apply to other parts of Scotland. Because there are parts of Scotland and there are sites in Scotland that are well managed and well appreciated by those living on them. I'm being told now to wind down, so I'll finish by saying that we welcome the committee's report. The full response was provided. It was compiled with input across all government departments and sets out clearly our proposals to address the recommendations. And I look forward to progressing this work in light of these findings and recommendations as part of making Scotland the country we want it to be.
Many thanks. I now call on Mary Fee, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Before I progress into my contribution today, I'd like to take a few moments to thank the members of the Equal Opportunities Committee for their hard work and dedication in bringing forward this report today. And I'd also personally like to thank my fellow committee members for the support they gave me in my time as convener. And I also must give special thanks to the clerks and the staff for all the tremendous support they gave me too in my time as convener. Scottish Labour welcomes this report and supports the findings and recommendations. However, Presiding Officer, throughout this report and the report on gypsy travellers and care, there is a recurring theme. And that theme is one of a lack of leadership at a national level. The Equality and Human Rights Commission Scotland, in their briefing for this afternoon, stated that relations between the gypsy travelling and the settled community is the single greatest community relations challenge the country faces, adding that these problems are not insurmountable but require leadership and resources. And one potential reason for that lack of leadership runs throughout the report, and it's the lack of political will, not just in central government, but in local and of public apathy. And as the Minister said in her opening remarks, the issue is constantly being looked at. And I do wonder then at the lack of progress that has been made on this issue if it is constantly looked at. Respectable racism is a challenge faced by the Gypsy Traveller community. If we were to replace the two words Gypsy Traveller with any other ethnic group, we would not be having this debate today. Action would have been taken long ago, and leadership would have been exhibited in haystacks. And, Presiding Officer, MECOP brought to my attention the following quotes that show we are some way off from tackling the discriminatory attitudes across the country and perpetuated by the media and by local politicians. One Aberdeen councillor is quoted as saying, "Putting a Gypsy Traveller's halting site next to a school is morally wrong." And a Dundee councillor reported... Certainly, yes.
Mark MacDonald.
Thank the member for giving way, and I recognise the comment that she makes. As somebody who served on Aberdeen City Council from 2007 to 2012, when this issue was trying to be dealt with, would she acknowledge the role that many of her Labour colleagues played in banding around rhetoric which was frankly unsuitable?
This is not a party political issue. This crosses all political parties, as the member will know. A Dundee councillor is reported to have called on Dundonians to play their part in deterring travelling people from visiting the city, further calling on the people of Dundee to refuse to give work to Gypsy travellers, so that we may see an end to these people coming to Dundee. Yes, certainly.
Christian Allard.
I would just have a question to the member, presiding officer, regarding this quote regarding a Dundee councillor. Does the member suggest that we should, as parliamentarians, as local councillors, asking the people to take work from tract or from in the letterboxes which only have a mobile phone number? Because I think that was the issue. To be careful not to get taking any kind of work from people who advertise only with a mobile phone number.
Mary Fee.
I thank the member for his point. The point I'm trying to make is across the country, these attitudes exist. And unless we highlight them, we will never, ever get rid of them. And it is not a party political issue. It's an issue that affects everyone. Now, as I've just said, I'm aware that people from all parties make these remarks, but how can we expect the public to change attitudes when politicians get away with it? And unless we publicise it, we will never end it. Equally, there are great examples of quotes with positivity from local and civic leaders. However, the level of coverage they receive is often on a different grade. Scottish Labour recognises many Gypsy travellers in Scotland continue to face discrimination. Although the population of this ethnic group is unknown, with estimates going from between 2,000 to 20,000, the level of discrimination are greatly disproportionate. This week we've heard a lot about the Government's programme for Scotland and repeatedly heard from the First Minister and his Cabinet about creating a fairer country and empowering communities. Yet it appears that the Gypsy traveller community is often overlooked. Page 50 in the programme places great emphasis on the Government's vision of equality and social justice as central to achieving a fairer Scotland. All 4 bullet points in section 19 relate to Gypsy travellers, but nothing in the Government's agenda aims to improve the lives, experiences and environment of this overlooked group. During evidence sessions in the report, we heard many Gypsy travellers have to hide who they are, meaning such a rich cultural heritage is cloaked for fear of persecution. How can any Gypsy traveller feel this can be overcome when the Government won't set up steps to tackle discrimination, often perpetuated by the lack of understanding by some in the media? Presiding officer, having visited sites in different areas of the country, I have witnessed the shocking standards of living that Gypsy travellers face. Overflowing septic tanks, children bathing in freezing cold amenity blocks, poorly lit paths, lack of bus stops and outside toilets. Nobody should be expected to live in these standards. During the visits, I also met some strong Gypsy traveller women that have overcome a lack of education and taught themselves to read. Strong women that care for the elderly and the children in their community, with little help from services that many others would require. Presiding officer, the report raises some grave concerns about how Gypsy travellers live in Scotland. and we are concerned at the apparent lack of progress since the previous inquiry into gypsy travellers in 2004-2005. The poor cooperation...
I'd be grateful if you draw to a close, please.
The poor cooperation from COSLA during the evidence session leaves a lot to be desired. However, the follow-up response from the COSLA Chief Executive creates a bit more positivity and hope that we can find solutions to tackle the real issues. Scottish Labour supports the inquiry, supports the recommendation and hopes that the Government will take forward these recommendations to make a real difference to the lives of gypsy travellers.
Many thanks. Now call on Alex Johnson, up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I begin, as other speakers have done, by saying a few words about the revolving door that is the Equal Opportunities Committee. I arrived on the Equal Opportunities Committee sort of between the two reports that we're now discussing. The first one was very much the responsibility, as far as the Conservatives were concerned, of my colleague Annabel Goldie. However, I took over in time for the second one. In fact, I noticed that it says in the report that I became a member of the committee on the 17th of January. This is perhaps a slight misrepresentation, since I think I'd been attending for 2 months as a substitute before I became an official member. However, the experience of this, preparing this report is something which I genuinely enjoyed. I have had a certain amount of awareness of the problems relating to the gypsy traveller community within the North East, in my own region, for some time, and I have in the past taken the opportunity to go on to unauthorised sites in some cases and speak to the gypsy travellers to find out what their views were. But the opportunity to meet gypsy travellers, both in their own environment and here in the Parliament, was one which I enjoyed. I discovered, for example, that one of the limited number of families within the gypsy traveller community bears my own name. In fact, on the morning of the 4th of February in Clinterty, when we had an informal discussion, I found myself sitting beside a young man, and I introduced myself to him. I said, "Hello, my name's Alex Johnson," and he said, "So's mine." On that day, we also had the opportunity to meet a broad range of representatives, but of course, those of us who got that day to meet Sammy Stewart will always be able to remember that he was a good laugh, a man who missed his calling as a stand-up comedian. One of the ironies, I suppose, is, and we never quite got to the bottom of it, was how that day at Clinterty, we appeared to meet only men who were willing to talk to us. However, only 3 days later, when we met in Parliament in a round-table session, we met only women from the travelling community. As I said, we never quite got to the bottom of that divide. But what we did find is that the travellers themselves are very articulate and very well able to put across their views. They're one of these groups which will always be able to express themselves fluently, however, don't benefit in the way that they should from that fluency. We discovered, for example, that the problems that gypsy travellers face and the problems that are faced by the settled community relating to gypsy travellers differ significantly across Scotland. We heard, for example, that there seems to be a particularly smooth relationship in the Argyll area, compared with other parts of Scotland at least. We heard that in large parts of the South West there are a significant number of travellers who are in permanent accommodation. And of course we also heard that in the North East, my own home ground, there is quite a degree of seasonal movement. And that is where the problem can arise in relation to unauthorised camps. We also, however, heard at some length that there are significant problems facing the community relating to accommodation, to the provision of health care and the provision of education. It was perhaps something I should also pay tribute to, is the number of young people from the gypsy traveller community who were able to talk to us fluently and express their needs and their desires, having had only very limited access to education. When we look at the recommendations that are contained within the report, there is a great deal that I believe is worthy of support. In fact, the Conservatives do, of course, support the broad thrust of this report. However, there are one or two concerns that I believe we need to address. There is the fact that local authorities, especially those in the North East, have been unable to solve the problem of unauthorised encampments, which has persisted for many years now. Similarly, private landowners have been left to deal with the problem on their own while the police maintain their presumption against prosecution. For ordinary people faced with an unauthorised encampment in their community, there seems to be no support whatsoever, while travellers themselves know all their rights, have the support of human rights groups, and are only too aware of how far they can exploit the establishment, which is afraid to act for fear of criticism. The Scottish Government has a long record of failure in addressing the very real concerns of the settled community regarding unauthorised encampments. I therefore believe that it is extremely important in the face of this that strong leadership is delivered. Evidence of the local authorities in the North East is that, in spite of the fact that there is a determined effort to establish the campsites that would be necessary in order to deal with the problem, there is inevitably political pressure that undermines that. So if local authorities are unfit to take this through to its conclusion, there is no alternative but strong leadership from the Scottish Government in order to force through these changes. Discussion groups will not deliver. During the course of the inquiry, COSLA resisted the invitation to become a significant part of this process. For that reason, I look forward to hearing what the Government will do in response to this report, but I also look forward to the day when they will deliver that strong leadership and we will eventually begin to progress to a long-term solution to this unfortunate problem.
Many thanks. Now move to open debate. I call on Mark MacDonald to be followed by Siobhan McMahon. 6-minute speeches.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I begin with apology that I have to leave at the conclusion of my speech to get to a public meeting in my constituency this evening, but I did notify you in advance to that effect. I was interested to read the report from the committee and note that the committee took evidence at the Clinterty site, which is located within my constituency. It has 17 permanent plots and 4 short-term plots. One of the difficulties that the council has always faced is that these plots are invariably always being let at the time when encampments arrive in Aberdeen, and therefore there is no suitable alternative site for the council to direct the travelling community to. Now, this is an issue which I am more than familiar with, Presiding Officer, both as an MSP now, but also in my time as a local councillor, because as a local councillor for Dice, Buxman and Dainston, over the summer of 2007, just after being elected, there were a number of encampments within my council ward which led to the heightened tensions that members have identified. And as part of the administration grouping coalition in Aberdeen, I did what I could to try and get this issue addressed. Indeed, rather than it being the convener of the North Area Committee who moved recommendations on establishing halting sites, I had to do it as a member of the committee because the convener at that time was unwilling to put his head above the parapet and take those tough decisions. And what we found during the time that we were in administration was that the lack of leadership pervaded across the council, both in terms of our coalition colleagues who were unwilling to take a stance in favour of halting sites and pursue them, and also the rhetoric, the often reprehensible rhetoric, which I will return to, of opposition councillors who sought to make political capital from the issue and sought to put us in a difficult position. We took the approach, therefore, that one of the difficulties that we faced as a council was that there would always be inevitably a clash between the need to establish a halting site and the kickback that you would get from the settled community if you attempted to establish a site next to them. And we took the view that one of the ways to deal with that would be to put a requirement in the council's local development plan that in certain sizes of new development, the requirement to establish a halting site should be part of the local development plan. Again, we found ourselves being attacked from political opportunists in that regard, but we still pressed ahead with it nonetheless. And we fast forward now to 2013 and the beginning of this year, and plans were announced by the council administration to develop halting sites. But the way in which the plans were firstly unveiled and then the complete failure to consult on those sites has badly damaged community relations in Aberdeen yet further. And that is one of the difficulties that there is that if you are going to take the approach of establishing halting sites, you have to engage with the settled community as well, because we understand that it is a difficult sell for politicians. But to do nothing to try and consult with communities and bring communities with you is simply not good enough. And what we see in Aberdeen at the moment is a council that is attempting to pass the buck on this issue, because we know that the establishment of halting sites is a responsibility of the council. But they have moved at the recent full council meeting in August that they will not progress a halting site until the Scottish Government grants a bylaw to the City of Aberdeen, a bylaw which Councillor Willie-Young said would make encampments a criminal and not just a civil offence. I don't think that helps move the issue forward in the way that the Equal Opportunities Committee would wish to see. And indeed, letters to me from both the Solicitor General and from Police Scotland would indicate that a bylaw is entirely unnecessary, because the existence of halting sites in and of themselves will allow for the councils to be free to take appropriate steps where an unauthorised encampment exists within their area and there is a reluctance of that encampment to move to the halting sites that have been created. Back to the issue, Presiding Officer, of rhetoric. And I understand that emotions often run high on this, and you only need to look at the reportage in the papers and the letters pages and the letters that we all, those of us who have encampments in our constituencies or in council wards, receive from members of the settled community to recognise that emotions run high. And that's why it's vitally important that we, as politicians, be it at a national level or a local level, are very careful in the language that we use when dealing with this issue, because we have a responsibility not to heighten tensions and not to inflame opinion. And the current housing convener of Aberdeen City Council, Neil Cooney, said recently that Aberdeen City Council recognises gypsy travellers as a marginalised, vulnerable group who historically have experienced discrimination and disadvantage. And I think that that is a statement that we would all agree with. The difficulty I have is that this is the same Neil Cooney who, when in opposition in Aberdeen City Council in 2007, hit the headlines accusing gypsy travellers of environmental terrorism. Such rhetoric has no place in the discussion. Indeed, at the time, Alfie Kefford, the chairman of the Gypsy Council, said that Councillor Cooney's remarks were highly offensive and said, "We are extremely angry at what this man has said and want him sacked." Rather than sacking him, he's now been appointed as the convener of Housing and Environment and is responsible for Aberdeen City Council's leadership of the gypsy traveller situation. If that's the approach that is being taken at a local level, putting individuals who use that kind of rhetoric in positions of leadership on this issue, it's little wonder we've seen little movement in this regard. I very much hope that all of us can use our influences on councillors and local politicians to ensure that this discussions and debates that need to happen in a respectful manner, rather than using this kind of rhetoric.
Many thanks. Now call on Siobhan McMahon to be followed by John Mason. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. May I start my remarks as well by saying how much I'm going to miss Mary Fee as convener of the Equal Opportunities Committee. I'm not sure Mary feels the same way, but certainly the committee benefited from her leadership, and I welcome Margaret to the post and hope that she can follow in Mary's footsteps. She certainly did this morning, indeed, especially with her early morning start. When writing this speech, I was trying to think of something positive I could say to open my remarks with. However, I failed on the occasion when speaking about gypsy travellers. Now, before SNP members shout at me, my remarks are not intended solely for this present government. They're intended for the governments gone before them and to every local authority in Scotland as well as COSLA. The reason I say this is simple. I heard consistently from gypsy travellers throughout the evidence sessions to the Equal Opportunities Committee about the systemic failures that they have been subjected to by those people in positions to help for far too long. The failure of leadership, as others have pointed out, is key to this. No one seems to want to take responsibility, even for attempting to try and alleviate some of the problems the gypsy traveller community face on a daily basis. Our report aimed to be hard-hitting, as all the members of the committee felt that the problems we had been hearing about and seeing for ourselves in the site visits had to be addressed now. We were acutely aware during our evidence sessions that this was not the first, nor the second report that the Equal Opportunities Committee had undertaken into these matters, and yet very little has changed in all of that time. The lack of suitable sites for the Gypsy Traveller community across Scotland was self-evident as the committee travelled across the country, visiting numerous sites. However, that wasn't the only problem with the sites. During my own site visit, John Finney and I were invited into one woman's home, a home she shares with her husband and very young children. The caravan window had been smashed and hadn't been replaced, meaning that all the heat from a small electric fire was escaping without bringing much warmth to her family. When we asked her if someone was coming to repair it, she informed us that she rents a caravan from the Housing Association, but they believe it is her responsibility to replace the window, something she couldn't afford to do. This woman pays her rent and council tax, and yet could not get a replacement window. If the same thing was happening in a bricks and mortar type house, we would all be rightly outraged and ask the pertinent questions. But in this instance, people just shrug their shoulders. It's simply not good enough for situations like this to arise. However, we know that this matter is not a one-off, as other members reported similar things, if not worse things, back to the committee. This is why we believe it important to stress the need for higher living standards on sites. Further, we believe that it's essential that Gypsy travellers have the same rights and responsibilities as people living in fixed accommodation. In order for this to be more than a recommendation, we need the Scottish Government and local authorities, via COSLA, if necessary, to put an action plan in place to tackle this sort of issue. We also need the housing associations that are responsible for some of the sites across the country to take their responsibilities in the tenancy agreement seriously and not see the agreement as something that should be signed and agreed to only by the Gypsy travellers themselves. And I listened to the Minister's comments in her opening speech, and I understand that she understands our recommendation and that she is working towards a solution. But what I would say to her is, we need the action. I understand you don't want to get it wrong and you don't want to rush it, but a time frame on when that would likely to happen would be useful. I recently visited the Gypsy Traveller site at Larkhall in South Lanarkshire, as I wanted to get a better understanding of the site provision in my own region. I was told by those currently residing there that they felt it was a good site and that the site manager was effective. However, the residents wished the site to be expanded in order that other family members currently residing in other parts of Scotland could either live or come to visit. I was delighted to hear that people actually wanted to stay on the site, given my previous experiences of sites. I know that Larkhall is not a one-off, but it is the exception. That cannot continue. I urge the Scottish Government to work with their partners to collate information on how to make a site work, not only for the Gypsy Traveller community, but for the wider community, as the example I've just spoken about shows it can be done. There is a fundamental issue with the way our society views the Gypsy Traveller community. Too often, we see an all too prevalent attitude which castigates the ethnic group as a problem community rather than an asset to the wider community. The Scottish Human Rights Commission supports this view, describing discrimination against Gypsy travellers as the last bastion of respectable racism. Tabloid journalism regularly demonises the travel culture, and television programmes propagate the type of negative cultural stereotypes not seen against any other minority communities since the 1980s. Now, as we've heard, MECOP provided a briefing to the committee members highlighting the fact that elected representatives have recently abused their positions in the media to attack the Gypsy Traveller community. The quotes have been read by Mary Fee, but the importance of the quote has to be taken by this chamber, because we know that those members sitting in this chamber will be appalled that such statements have been made. But the truth is that that councillor is not the only person with such appalling thoughts. In a 2010 Scottish Social Attitude Survey, 44% of people thought Gypsy travellers would be unsuitable as primary school teachers. If we are to tackle this type of discrimination, then we need a national public awareness campaign aimed at tackling discrimination and racism against the Gypsy Traveller community. I know that the Scottish Government have already been in discussions about how best to carry this out. I understood what the Minister was saying, but again, I would urge her to come with a timetable of when that's likely to take place, because she said she was announcing it today to Parliament, but the information that she announced was already contained in the report that was sent back to the committee by the Government, so more information would certainly be helpful.
You must conclude, please.
As Mary Fee stated earlier, if the levels of discrimination currently being faced by the Gypsy Traveller community were happening towards any other protected characteristic as defined by the Equality Act 2010, there would be public outrage. It's simply not good enough that the treatment experienced by this group has been allowed to continue for so long, and I urge the Government to do everything in its powers to address this scandal now before it's too late. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm afraid we have no extra time in this debate, so I'll attempt to give members a 1-minute warning. John Mason, to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I joined the committee in October last year, which was partway through the evidence sessions, and so I was only involved in the report Where Gypsy Travellers Live. However, it became clear to me early on that this was a subject in which very slow progress was being made. The report starts off, "We are extremely frustrated," and I, for one, share that frustration and fully support the tone of the report. I should also say at this stage that I thought Mary Fee had been an excellent and very fair chair for the committee, and I was disappointed to hear that she was leaving. However, I also welcome Margaret McCulloch. I think we do have to accept that this is not an easy topic to deal with or even to discuss, and it's certainly not easy to find a solution that everyone will accept. But the starting point is that we have a seriously disadvantaged minority group here. With some exceptions, living conditions are frequently not acceptable, and health and education provision is patchy, to say the least. Over the years, we have changed our attitude and speech in relation to a number of minority groups. We're not as far on as we want to be as a society, but it is much less common nowadays to hear people say that they do not want to be living next to Jewish people, or next to black people, or next to gay people. However, sadly, it is not unusual to still hear people openly say that they do not want to be living next to Gypsy travellers. And not only do we hear that from individual citizens, but we also hear it through the media and from some politicians. This is not acceptable. In the briefing for today, the Equality and Human Rights Commission in Scotland gave a quote which Mary Fee has already used, and which says the single greatest community relations challenge the country faces is in relation to Gypsy travellers. Now, in terms of the numbers involved, this may not be the biggest challenge, but in terms of how poor the relationship is, I have to say I largely agree with the EHRC. We have taken other minority groups in our society seriously, but it seems to me we have not taken Gypsy travellers seriously. It was clear from our witnesses that there have been particular issues in the northeast of Scotland where the more vibrant economy has attracted this often mobile section of our population to jobs in the likes of Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire. This was brought home to me when I was campaigning in the Aberdeen-Donside by-election, and the subject came up a number of times on the doors. It was clearly a sensitive area. And I'm not entirely clear why this debate has taken so long to happen, given that our report came out in March. But it has been suggested it was delayed because it was too sensitive to discuss during the by-election. If that is the case, it is regrettable, but it does underline the sensitivity of this subject. So whose responsibility is it to improve things? Well, all of us to some extent. I do not believe we can say it is only the local councils who have to act. I totally support the independence of local government and that they should be allowed to deal with issues in their remit in the way that they choose to do so. The Concordat has been a big improvement on what went before, and I fully support it. But local councillors are clearly in a difficult position, often with a majority of their electorate openly hostile to any new site in the locality. It takes a lot of guts to support a new site when there is such clear local opposition. And that is why we chose the wording of paragraph 49 on page 13 as we did. It says, starting the third line, evidence strongly suggests a need for leadership from the Scottish Government in supporting the development of sites. That word supporting. We see this as being essential in supporting local communities and elected representatives, both in bringing sites to fruition and setting an example against discrimination. And I think that is the way forward I want to see, not us blaming each other, not saying it is only one person that has to act in this, but support from central government for local government, because this is a serious problem that is only going to be solved if we are all involved in it. It is not fair to leave local authorities to take all of this forward on their own. We do need national leadership from government and from Parliament, both in relation to achieving more sites and in the wider aim of changing the whole tone of the debate. Specifically, as has been mentioned, we were disappointed with COSLA's initial response. However, I have to say I'm happier with Rory Mayor's more recent response, in his response to the committee letter of 27th June, where he promises to give full consideration to the matters raised and consider reports going to each executive group within COSLA. Similarly, I'm pleased that Shona Robertson has an overarching responsibility for the equality portfolio, and both she and Margaret Burgess are involved in this subject. In the Government's response to the report, I'm very happy to see that they accept that there really is a problem. That's a good starting point. The question is, where are we going and how fast are we going? There are a number of groups and individuals out there who are sceptical of more studies and more reports.
Final minute.
At the very least, it would be helpful to have clear timescales, or at least target timescales, as to how quickly new sites, in particular, can be provided. In conclusion, I think we can all accept that gypsy travellers face a serious amount of discrimination. I also accept that there is a fair amount of goodwill to try and improve things. But if one thing comes out from today's debate, I would just ask for more urgency in all of this. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call Malcolm Chisholm to be followed by Christian Allard.
To join with the rest of the Chamber in welcoming this report, which gives a valuable insight into the real lives of the travelling community in Scotland, as well as making several important recommendations. The traditional culture of the travelling community has been present throughout the UK for centuries, but it is only recently that they were given the status of an ethnic group, with their rights and responsibilities covered by the Race Relations Act of 1976. It is therefore our responsibility to ensure that as a minority group they are respected for the lifestyle choices they make, and that their human rights and living standards are matters of concern to us all. The accounts of the impoverished conditions highlighted in the report paint a shocking picture of neglect. In one example, babies are found to be bathing in freezing water. An absence of any lighting makes the area unsafe and impossible to navigate after dark. There are overflowing septic tanks and a lack of any infrastructure for children to play. Decent living conditions are the basic human right of every person, regardless of their background, but at present there is a real shortage of approved sites for the current population. As the report highlights, there is a lack of information available on the current numbers of gypsy travellers, with the most recent estimate taken in 2009. Local authorities and public agencies must therefore look to include this community in their service planning processes. And as Amnesty International point out, the absence of figures on population size should not negate this planning requirement. The report's recommendations quite rightly commend the work of Planning Aid for Scotland in helping gypsy travellers to engage with the process. This has been maintained at £237,000 per annum, and I hope the Government will continue to provide that level of support to Planning Aid for Scotland for that work. The problems facing the gypsy traveller community go far beyond poor housing conditions, but many of the issues faced throughout life have their roots in these conditions. The report cites the north east of Scotland as facing particular problems, and I would agree that any work to develop the necessary new site should have a special focus on that area. National policy, however, must reflect the urgent need for a greater number of safe sites throughout Scotland. At present, there is no obligation on local authorities to provide these, and I believe a statutory duty, as in England and Wales, should be seriously considered. The report highlights an absence of evidence that adequate steps have been taken by local authorities to address need, and COSLA has to fulfil its role in supporting communities to do that. I also support the recommendation about the development and implementation of a standard gypsy traveller site tenancy agreement. Gypsy travellers in their working lives face discrimination constantly and are often turned away from job opportunities as a result of their home addresses being recognised as traveller sites. Much of this discrimination is based on negative preconceptions of the characteristics of travelling life, based to a great extent on representations in mainstream and social media commentary. We can only encourage a change of attitudes when we tackle these negative stereotypes and emphasise that antisocial behaviour in a small number of sites does not represent the population as a whole. In view of this, the EHRC's illustrative guide for media outlets is profoundly welcome. Interaction with the community itself is vital if we are to make the right kind of progress. The committee report outlines some of the work carried out thus far in consultation, and I was heartened to read that there had been a great deal of work done with Minority Ethnic Carers of People Project, MECOP that is, who work closely with carers in difficult living situations and know the challenges faced. In their submission to the inquiry on gypsy traveller accommodation, the group quote a statement made in a previous submission 10 years ago. Many of the difficulties Gypsy travellers encounter and society's acceptance of prejudice towards this ethnic group, they say, are effectively legitimised by state policies which are at best outdated and paternalistic, at worst restrictive and discriminatory. They go on to highlight that the statement still holds true, notwithstanding the efforts that have been made, and they also point out that previous inquiries have failed to properly engage with the community. So few travellers were aware of this inquiry that the group made the laudable decision of gathering responses themselves, and I commend them for that. What came through in their snapshot of life in the Gypsy traveller community was a general feeling that the government has thus far failed to disseminate relevant information effectively, and as a result had also failed to engage and receive feedback. Many felt that their way of life was not understood and that their basic needs were not met. Many desire to be able to continue the tradition of travelling, but increasingly legal spaces for camping and parking are being closed down. Where they do travel, they face harassment from the settled community. Therefore, for the security of their families, they are often forced to remain in sites that are poorly managed and have very low living standards. Life on the edge of poverty with little security has led to the life expectancy for Gypsy travellers, men and women, being 10 years lower than the national average. All this is completely unacceptable. The common values that join the settled and travelling community together are far more important than the cultural differences that divide. It is important that in developing policy we do not see one group as other, but instead recognise their value as members of Scottish society with a distinct story to tell.
Many thanks. I now call Christian Allard to be followed by Murdo Fraser.
Presiding Officer, first I feel that I need to clarify my position. The Equal Opportunities Committee's report, Where Gypsy Travellers' Life, was published in March 2013. I can take no credit for it. I came to Parliament in May. However, when I joined the committee, I was very much aware of the good work of its members, particularly when they came to the northeast of Scotland to meet representatives of Gypsy travelling community at the Clinton site. The region I have the privilege and honour to represent today has a great tradition of welcoming travellers, and for good reasons. People in Scotland moved a lot in the past and with the season to find work. At the end of the 19th century, thousands of men and women would come to work in the herring industry around fishing ports during the catching season. The farming calendar would create seasonal work for labourers travelling from farm to farm in the northeast. There is a myth out there that the reason why Gypsy travellers are looking for work in the northeast today is because of the prosperity created by a vibrant energy sector. It is true that we are the powerhouse of the UK, but the northeast has much more to harvest than energy. From fishing in the North Sea to farming, we have kept our great tradition of producing wonderful food and drink. Every year, Presiding Officer, I attend the Lowrin Fair at O'Rain in Aberdeenshire. This 500-year-old fair was a gathering for traders bringing crafts, produce and livestock to the village and seasonal farm labourers looking for work. Many people moved about in the old days, and they were always welcome. Their arrival was expected and celebrated. This picture was very much the same across Europe. I remember looking forward to the caravans taking over the main square of my own village in France every year. It was cause for celebrations, as travellers brought us our own funfair for the week. What has changed over the years for our attitude to Gypsy travellers to become what it is today? What has changed for the report of the Equal Opportunities Committee to call for a government-led campaign with the remit of establish a zero-tolerance approach to discrimination? I agree with the findings of the report that after 12 years of debating the issue, the appalling situation of many Gypsy travellers is little changed. But I'm encouraged that the committee found some commendable initiatives in the North East. I have to thank the Aberdeenshire councillor who wrote to update me on the progress made. One of them is Councillor Alan Henry, and you will find him pictured on page 8 of his booklet. As you can see, at local level, people are engaging with the issue, and yet the outcomes are still very disappointing 12 years on. The Scottish Government has already answered most of the points that we are debating today, and I thank Shona Robinson, who has now the ministerial responsibility for the equality portfolio, and the Minister of Housing and Welfare, Margaret Burgess, for answering the last correspondence from the committee and for understanding the challenge before us. I'm not the only one in this debate to note, Presiding Officer, that me too, I was shocked when I first read the report, and I share the Equal Opportunity Committee's frustration with the lack of action from COSLA. If you read on page 18 of the report, when asked to respond to our call of evidence, which included questions on how planning for gypsy traveller sites is taken into account, the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities stated in its entirety that COSLA does not provide services or have the relations of the sort you are seeking information about. Again, on page 20, I quote, "We were disturbed by COSLA's response to our call of evidence, which gives the impression that it does not see its role as being to support local authorities, not during the planning process. We ask that COSLA clarify its position and that local authorities, as far as COSLA's role allows, use COSLA as a forum for support and partnership." This is the kind of attitude that has stopped us moving on as a society and accepting gypsy travellers' right. The Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, COSLA, is pivotal to the implementation and promotion of the strategy needed at national and local level. There has been dereliction of responsibility, in my views, from COSLA, and I ask why the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities thought it could ignore this report. The Scottish Government wrote to us to say it is ready to work with local government, and we hear that today, including COSLA, and directly with individual local authorities, as appropriate in order to effect change and measure success collaboratively. Presiding Officer, gypsy travellers do not travel on a daily basis all year round. Families require safe and secure places from which to do their travelling. As gypsy travellers grow older and become less able to travel on a regular basis, they require safe and secure stopping places. Gypsy travellers also sometimes stop travelling for periods of time to care for sick or elderly relatives or to continue a child's education within a supportive school environment. This is the reality that our local authorities are struggling to cope with, some more than others, as we have heard earlier. This report must be the start to finding solutions to local problems. I'm really impressed with the time and the amount of work the Equal Opportunities Committee has dedicated to write this report. I hope members enjoy their trip to Aberdeen, and I'm sure the committee will consider going back to see the improvement made to the places and conditions in which gypsy travellers live in the North East. Next, Presiding Officer, I expect the Scottish Government-led public awareness campaign to start to change attitudes towards the gypsy traveller communities. But this awareness-raising campaign can only take discrimination if we all participate in it, at national and at local level. Presiding Officer, we, as members of the Scottish Parliament, have a key responsibility to bring back respect for gypsy traveller communities and to celebrate the diversity of our nation, a diversity that we in this Parliament are very proud of.
Many thanks. Now call Murdo Fraser to be followed by Linda Fabiani.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm not a member of the Equal Opportunities Committee, but I read the report very closely due to my constituency interest. And I commend members of the committee on the report, and like my colleague Alec Johnson, I'm very pleased to support the recommendations that are set out in it. The travelling community in Scotland plays a large and important role in the culture and life of our country. And I agree much more needs to be done to prevent the stigma and discrimination currently suffered by those in the gypsy traveller community. As the report points out, accommodation and living space is without doubt the root cause of many of the problems they face. The desperate conditions in which many travellers find themselves must be addressed by the Scottish Government. An increase in appropriate sites is required as a matter of urgency, and it is Holyrood's role to encourage and lead local authorities in this endeavour, as the report says. I hope the Minister will forgive me for taking time to lobby her on behalf of some of the current issues affecting residents and travellers within my own region, because the emergence of unauthorised traveller sites is a pressing matter for communities and local authorities in both Fife and Perth and Kinross. In recent years, an unauthorised site near the Broxden Business Park in Perth has been used by travellers, creating serious issues in the neighbouring Oakbank residential area. And indeed, it's only this week that a group of travellers left this unauthorised site, leaving it, according to a report in the Courier newspaper just yesterday, and I quote, strewn with litter, which causes a great deal of concern in the local community. There have also been serious issues on the South Inch in Perth and also in Fife at Glenrothes, Dalgety Bay and elsewhere. What I would stress is that there needs to be a mutual respect between both... Yes, Mr Robertson.
Dennis Robertson.
I thank the member for taking a brief intervention. Would the member acknowledge that gypsy travellers had traditionally stopping sites throughout Scotland, and with the emergence of business parks throughout Scotland, a lot of these sites have been taken from them? Where are they to go?
Murdo Fraser.
Well, I'm just going to come on to address that very point, Mr Robertson, and you'll bear with me in my remarks. Members present who represent Fife and who attend the regular meetings we have with the local Chamber of Commerce will be familiar with many complaints there are from businesses and local residents about travellers pitching up on privately owned land and refusing to move. In some instances, when travellers move on, these unauthorised sites, and we say unauthorised, but they're actually illegal, are left in a filthy state, covered in rubbish, dog waste and worse. And in a perverse legal twist, it is the innocent business owner or landowner who is then left with the task and the cost of cleaning up the mess, and if they refuse to do so, can be served with an enforcement notice by the authorities and have to bear the cost. Now, this behaviour, presiding officer, is not just morally and socially unacceptable, it is also illegal. The Trespass Scotland Act 1865, still extant, makes it a criminal offence to camp on land without the owner's permission. So why do we see no prosecutions when there is such a flagrant breach of the law? Because national guidance from ACPOS includes a general presumption against prosecution. So those who are the victims of this behaviour, the innocent victims of this behaviour, despite the fact that the law is on their side, will not usually have the assistance of the authorities. This cannot be acceptable. We cannot have a situation where the police refuse to arrest those who are in breach of the law, whoever they may be. And it's this general presumption not to take legal action against gypsy travellers for the crime of trespass which creates so many tensions within communities. Now, to return to the point Dennis Robertson's made, I entirely accept, and this comes through this report loud and clear, is the lack of traveller-specific sites exacerbates this issue. But two wrongs don't make a right, Mr Robertson, and the rule of law should be enforced regardless of non-harassment policies, because private citizens and businesses, some of them struggling in the current climate, should not have to suffer and pay the cost because of the failings of local authorities. It's not their fault. And where there have been clear public order abuses, including urinating in public, dogs running wild, littering, fly tipping and other antisocial crimes, the police must use their powers to act. Some, not a majority, but some travellers seem to believe they have carte blanche to do whatever they want without fear of prosecution from the police. This must change in order to create a more harmonious relationship between travellers and the community in which they live. So I'm calling for some common sense on this issue. And I was very taken with what the Minister said in her opening remarks about the need for balance in this debate. We need to urgently settle this issue by making land available for travellers to live on. But we cannot, in the meantime, have travellers setting up camp wherever they wish in areas that were never designed for human habitation and leaving them in a terrible state. And residents whose lives are negatively impacted by travellers must have the backing of the law, of the police and lawmakers. And similarly, travellers who suffer from discrimination and hate crime abuse must also have the backing of law enforcement officials. Mutual respect, understanding and common sense must be the cornerstones of any future traveller strategy. The Scottish Government has a very important role to play in ensuring that gypsy travellers are given access to clean, habitable sites and the public services they require. But in exchange, travellers need to recognise they also have responsibilities as part of society. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call into Fabiani to be followed by Jim Hume.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful to Christian Allard for reminding me that it was in March that I turned on my radio and heard Mary Fee, then convener of the committee, talking about this inquiry and report, talking about it very, very well, I may say. But what really struck me at that point was, gosh, nothing has changed since I was on the first Equal Opportunities Committee in the first term of this Parliament, back in 2001 when that report came out. And that got me to thinking back to that time. And at that point, I I suspect, like those who came to it new on this Equal Opportunities Committee, was extremely shocked at what we learned. I thought I knew a bit about what we call the Gypsy Traveller community through reading, through a love of the culture and song and storytelling, and by the fact that I lived and worked in Argyll for some time, where there's a lot of travellers. So I thought I knew quite a bit. But I was totally shocked at what I learned during that first inquiry. I learned about, Malcolm Chisholm talked about life expectancy of the community. I was really shocked at the discrimination suffered when people tried to access GP services, tried to get into hospital, and I was horrified at the level of bullying that was prevalent against Gypsy Traveller children in schools, particularly secondary schools, so much so that the dropout rate from education was very, very high. There are a couple of things strike me particularly in my memory. You know, this is a very privileged job. You meet people you wouldn't meet otherwise, and there's things that just stick. One of them is being in Argyll, in a site, a pretty bad site. However, meeting a lady who invited me into her trailer, who had been part of what was called the settled community, had been given a few houses by the local authority and had given them up. And when I said to her, please try and explain to me why, what is it? It was very, very simple. She said, I don't like living in a house because you have to stand up to see out the windows. And that really, really struck me as, for me, a recognition that I would never understand that. And I think that's part of the problem in what we try and do as local authorities, as government, as individuals who've got used to all the trappings of being settled, is we try to understand, but we'll never understand. So why don't we just accept? Why don't we just accept that people require to live differently than the mainstream of us have chosen how to live, and make accommodation and accept it and get on with it? And we have a UN rapporteur here at the moment who's looking at housing generally across the UK. And I know that she is meeting with representatives of the Gypsy Traveller community again today. And I hope that, you know, we can reach an understanding with what she reports as well when it comes to it. The other thing I remember very much about that visit was going into a cafe in Argyll with a representative of the travelling community, realising that we were finding it awfully difficult to get served, wondering why, and saying to him, is this cafe always like this? And he said, no, it's because you're with me. And I was really, really shocked that this open form of discrimination was happening, you know, in our decade, while our parliament had been re-established, and it was happening. It was enforced when his wife stood outside the door and was motioning him to come out, and I said, tell her to come in for a lunch. And he said, oh no, she won't come in here, she's too frightened to come in here. And it's absolutely awful that we're allowing people to live like that in this day and age, especially when, as Siobhan mentioned, in some of these sites, we're talking about rent-paying tenants here, who don't have tenancy agreements, who don't have any real rights. They have occupancy agreements, which actually is nothing. I'm aware of the time, so I want to go on to develop this negative stereotyping and discrimination. I do think that we all have a responsibility to address that. And I know that the National Union of Journalists has recently come out with guidelines for their members, and it struck me looking at it that one of their main guidelines was resist the temptation to sensationalise issues involving travellers. Well, anything I've seen lately on TV that involves travellers absolutely sensationalises you know, what's happening there. Some of the headlines in newspapers are absolutely disgusting. And when I go back to what I said at the beginning, I was part of that in 2001. Here we are in 2013. And sadly, nothing has changed. Now, I remember back round about that time, I think it was the first Parliament, trying to put an amendment to the housing bill at the time that was voted down. And I'm actually not convinced that the same wouldn't happen again, because I think it's what Mark MacDonald said. We're all frightened to put our heads above the parapet in this one. But I think we do need a champion. I hope that will be Shona Robson in her equalities leadership role. I think we do need a champion. I think we need to be much more vocal at this and recognise that there are times when you have to do things that are very, very unpopular, but you do them because they are right. And I would like to see that happen in this subject.
Thank you. Before we move on, can I remind members to use each other's full names, please? Jim Hume, to be followed by Dennis Robertson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The term Gypsy Traveller, as we know, covers a broad range of groups descended from Scottish, Roma, Irish and other roots. And I'm proud, like others, to live in a diverse nation. And indeed, as Scots, we should be proud of our unique Gypsy Traveller heritage. I had a conversation with someone recently about this issue, and she told me, and I quote, "There's a thriving Gypsy population in my local area, which has been there for as long as I can remember, and long before that. The Gypsies here are an accepted part of the local community. They work and live here and are a part of the fabric of that area." The Gypsy Traveller population have a long history in the South region and are even celebrated. Even in the Yetum Common Riding's principles, they aren't standard bearers, braw lads or braw lassies, gala queens or cornets, but they're called the Baragaji and the Baramanishi. And anybody who knows a little of Romany knows that means a good man and a good woman. And if you do travel to Yetum, you will also find the Gypsy Palace, a wee single-storey house actually dating back to the 1600s, where King Charles II was coronated in 1898. Not the King Charles we would usually think of, but the last coronated king of the Gypsies, son of Queen Esther, Charles Fa Blythe. Over 10,000 people descended on Yetum for that coronation just over a century ago. So Gypsies, Romanese travellers aren't a new phenomenon, but have been a part of our culture for many generations. I would also echo much of what has been said today about the day-to-day challenges Gypsy travellers encounter, and particularly concerning is that as a group they continue to face discrimination, whether that's from individuals or institutions, even though they've been part of our culture for so long. In Scotland, we can be proud of a tolerant nation, always leading the way in stamping out discrimination and protecting our minority communities, which is why the findings of the report make it a genuinely distressing read. The observation by SHRC that discrimination towards Gypsy travellers was the last bastion of respectable racism is a shameful pill to swallow in a democratic society where there should be no room for such prejudice to fester. The report goes on to say that we are appalled at some of the standards we saw on sites and disgusted that rent-paying tenants were faced with such bleak living conditions. We wouldn't accept such living conditions for tenants in fixed housing. Why then is it okay to ignore the plight of Gypsy travellers? It's not acceptable in a fair and tolerant society. If we are to improve the lives of a Gypsy traveller population, then for me it's clear that two key things have to be tackled. We have to change attitudes that feed the discrimination, and we need a firm national approach to fixed and temporary homes with proper access to other services. The current arrangements clearly don't work, and we know from the evidence that this in turn creates and feeds into the social discontent of settled communities, often resulting in conflict and sensationalist media attention highlighted in the report. It's entirely reasonable, as the report says, that Gypsy travellers should enjoy the same housing rights and responsibilities and access to service as those tenants in the fixed housing sector. And I look forward to hearing from the Minister on this very point. There has been perhaps a political reluctance to deal with the issue head-on in the past, and indeed the Equality Human Rights Commission has underlined the need for political leadership, a view which I share and I think others do here today. There must also be a partnership working across all agencies, including COSLA, and I hope the Minister will encourage active engagement from COSLA. We must not shy away from tackling the issue on the basis that being seen to stand up for Gypsy travellers might seem unpopular. Of course.
Margaret MacDonald.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I apologise for being late. I had other business outside the chamber, but I'm glad that I come in at this point because I want to ask someone about this. How much more difficulty is there for gypsies from Scotland by the large number of Roma people that we've got coming from the east who don't seem to be all that popular in certain areas?
Jim Hume, you're approaching your last minute.
I think that was a question perhaps for the Minister, which I'm sure the Minister will take up. Presiding Officer, Scottish Gypsy travellers deserve all of the basic rights in life that we all here enjoy without a question. A decent standard of living, proper access to services and their culture and unique way of life deserve to be recognised and protected. However, the report concludes that discrimination is still one of the biggest barriers to site development, proper access to healthcare, education and employment, with many travellers reliant upon the voluntary sector for help with key services. The committee heard from Lizzie Johnson, who said she was forced to go into house so that she could get proper medication and health services for her younger son, and that one site she had lived on was just not suitable for people with disabilities. Presiding Officer, the committee's report, whilst upsetting, does at least afford an opportunity to achieve fair and decent living standards for our gypsy traveller population. Missing that opportunity would represent an abject failing on our part, and I sincerely hope that the Minister will take forward the committee's recommendations. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call Dennis Robertson to be followed by Michael McMahon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I firstly pay tribute to Mary Fee and my time on the Equal Opportunities Committee. Mary Fee was convener and led the committee, I think, very fairly, and indeed had a determination and grit, perhaps, to ensure that the gypsy travelling community had a fair voice in coming to this Parliament. A fair voice, Presiding Officer. Perhaps they haven't had a fair hearing. Gypsy travellers, I think, over the years, and maybe perhaps over the centuries, have not been understood. And I, for one individual, coming to this Parliament and meeting the gypsy travelling community for the first time when they had an awareness session organised by MECOP, find myself with maybe some degree of ignorance with regard to their culture. And one of the things, Presiding Officer, that became very evident, that there was a reluctance, somewhat, I think, yeah, it was a reluctance by some of the gypsy travelling people coming to give evidence to Parliament, because they asked the question, what's the point? We did this before. We've come before and nothing's happened. MECOP persuaded and maybe perhaps lent on them slightly to come and give that evidence, on the thought that maybe something else could happen. Linda Fabiani, I think, said, 2001, what's changed? Is it not disappointing to this chamber? Is it not disappointing to this Parliament that 12 years on we are now debating a situation that should have been dealt with back in 2001, and the changes that were required to be made then should have happened then? We cannot then afford to miss the opportunity for change this time. I listen with interest to the Minister's comments. I listen with interest to hear something that perhaps is different, something that we can grasp and say, yes, we've got it right this time. Yes, we're going out there to do what we should have done back in 2001. Yes, we're going to empower the gypsy travelling community. Yes, we're going to empower the people who need the direction and leadership, not just from this government and not just from this Parliament, but from COSLA, our local authorities. I was disappointed because I didn't hear the bugle call. I didn't hear the cavalry charge. Presiding Officer, I don't think the gypsy travelling community are asking a lot. I think they're asking the basic right to go into a health centre and be cared for, a basic right to housing that doesn't leak, a basic right to have maybe indoor facilities. A basic right that the legislation is actually there already for, but is never enforced. Mutual respect. Murdo Fraser said we need mutual respect. Both sides, see both sides. I agree with Murdo Fraser. There is a minority, but let's get it right, presiding officer. It is a very small percentage of the gypsy travelling community that go to unauthorised sites and leave them in a mess. The majority of the gypsy travelling community are upholding law-abiding citizens who just want the basic right to live as gypsy travellers in a community that has no prejudice towards them. Presiding officer, Margaret MacDonald in her intervention said, is there a difference between the Romanas and the other gypsy travelling communities? Yes, there is. When we went to Clinker Day in Aberdeen and heard the evidence there, we heard that, yes, you know what the problem is? It's the Irish travellers that are coming over here and causing the problems. We're getting the bad name because of. It happens in every community, presiding officer. I don't know if it's the Irish community. I don't know if it's those coming from Eastern Europe. But what I do know is that regardless, there should be no prejudice towards our gypsy travelling community. They wish to live their lives as law-abiding members of a community. And when we took evidence, we did hear that the majority of gypsy travellers don't wish to be part of the settled community, in the heart of the settled community. They're quite happy to have a site in the periphery, providing they have access to a bus stop, providing they have access to healthcare, providing they have access to a shop, providing they have access to schools for their children. Is that too much to ask, presiding officer? I don't think so. And I think this government need to put their head above the parapet and say, we cannot let 2013 go by like we let 2001 dissipate. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call Michael McMahon to be followed by Nigel Dawn.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I start by congratulating Mary Fee, the committee members and the clerks for compiling this report that we have before us today. In the 14 years that I've been here, there have been quite a few achievements of this Parliament that I'm honoured to have been able to play a part in. Among the most important of them for me was in helping to bring forward the first ever report of the Equal Opportunities Committee in 2001, after the issue of discrimination against gypsy travellers was first brought to my attention as the race reporter at that time, and issues raised in a letter from an individual traveller. Now, having taken on board the issues highlighted in that letter, I convinced the committee, which you'll recall, Deputy Presiding Officer, you were a member of, as was Linda Fabiani, that the evidence from organisations that represent gypsy travellers and individual gypsy travellers themselves, that we were so concerned at what we heard that we decided to appoint an advisor and conduct a full inquiry to ascertain the level at which public sector policies did actually discriminate against gypsy travellers. The committee published its report in June 2001 and it contained 37 recommendations, similar to the report that we have before us today. That report covered a range of issues relating to the standards and location of accommodation, on-site facilities, the management and cost of local authority and private sites, and the lack of facilities for roadside encampment. So what has changed? Virtually nothing, according to the new report. On education, worrying evidence highlighted key areas of difficulty in accessing services for gypsy traveller children, and in the management or lack of management of interrupted learning. So what has changed? Clearly not much. On health and community care, institutional discrimination was identified as an issue in health service provision. So what has changed? Little, if anything. On police and criminal justice, key issues were raised about the lack of awareness of gypsy traveller lifestyles and culture. So what has changed? Not very much, next to nothing. And when we debated that report in 2001, the committee unanimously took the view that the then Scottish Executive's response was a disappointment which fell into two categories: that the problem was someone else's responsibility, or the issue was already covered by a Scottish Executive policy. Sadly again, what has changed? That we concluded that if all of these issues were already covered, it was obvious that the policies were not working, because gypsy travellers were still facing discrimination in every area of public service delivery. So how disappointing then that here we are 12 years on, and the Equal Opportunities Committee in the 4th session of this Parliament has also completed a report on gypsy travellers which heard virtually all the same evidence, has more or less arrived at the same conclusions. Yet again, the key findings of an Equal Opportunities Committee report points to gypsy travellers' widespread experience of systematic failure among local authorities and organisations in ensuring that they have access to the same level of services and legal rights that are available to other inhabitants of Scotland. I could not agree more with the EHRC that at the heart of the problems faced by both gypsy travellers and the settled community is the absence of leadership, which means that instead of focusing on solutions, we get short-term action, which is more about firefighting than sorting out long-standing problems. No one can dispute that gypsy travellers have the right to travel, or that local residents have the right to be protected from unacceptable behaviour brought by anyone. As with all rights come responsibilities, and a balance has to be struck. But it will require more than warm words to achieve that. We need real understanding and commitment, and my experience is that this remains all too sadly lacking. When responding to the debate in 2001, the responsible minister at that time said that it had been painful to hear the criticism levelled by the committee at the administration. It was also observed that it was to the credit of the committee and the Parliament that we had a debate which put the executive under pressure to account for itself. Some things have clearly not changed in that regard when it comes to equal opportunities, and I hope that the Scottish Government are equally discomforted by this report. More regrettably, though, the gypsy traveller community is still facing a situation in which far too few local authorities understand their issues and make the necessary provisions. Just as in 2001, the Scottish Government has pleaded in its defence that it is doing what it can to address all of the points raised by the committee. Unfortunately, the evidence is just not there to support that assertion. Just as was the case 12 years ago, government policies could be identified and resources highlighted which pointed towards solutions for the issues raised. But the fact remains that much of what we have points to the fact that the buck is being passed and that the relevant policies are little more than dead letters that have never been delivered. So let's hope that this report takes the issue further forward than the last one did, so that in a decade's time, those who take part in any report on the condition of gypsy travellers in Scotland don't suffer the same déjà vu that we have here today. And just in conclusion, I'd like to recall an anecdote in my own area
20 seconds.
Has been brought up by other members. There's a tale of the pilgrims arriving in what we now know as America, when they asked the natives, "What did you call this country before we came here?" They said, "Ours." That is part of the problem, and we have to bear that in mind when we're talking about the gypsy traveller community in Scotland. Thank you.
Many thanks. Now Colin Nigel Don, to be followed by John Finney. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm very grateful to Linda Fabiani for her comments. I have to say that I think Linda Fabiani produced the one comment that I really wasn't expecting. And that was the reference to the lady who said you had to stand up to look out of the windows. Because, one, that took me by as much surprise as it will have taken anybody else. But two, because I think what followed it was right. We don't have to understand. We just have to solve the problems. And it may be that a lot of what the government will try to do is to get the settled community, which is the vast majority of us, to understand travellers, when maybe there is a degree of incapacity to understand. They are just different. And we have to respect that difference, even if we don't understand it. And maybe that's an important lesson that somebody needs to get, that we don't actually have to understand everything to be able to work past it. But it does then bring me to the other point which colleagues have made all the way through, which is that there are instinctive prejudices and in our attitudes as a society, and it's in all of us. We have our way of doing things. If somebody else does it another way, then we're instinctively, hang on, that's not the way I do it. I'm not sure I really want you next door. But the absolute crucial thing, which I think we all understand, is that it comes down to accommodation. Unless those who travel have decent accommodation, then you can't solve the education problems. You can't solve the healthcare problems. It just isn't going to happen. So accommodation turns out, I would suggest, to be the centre of this. Now, I have in my constituency in North Angus a site. I checked up on it this morning. It seems to be very well run. It is, in fact, more or less permanently full. It's quite close to one of my towns. It doesn't appear to give any particular problems. I'm delighted to say the children do get integrated into the local school and are dealt with accordingly. Plainly, as a society, we can deal with this, but we're dealing in that particular situation with what will often, I think, be the norm, where people who want to be able to travel nonetheless have somewhere where they can stay most of the time and actually fit in with the society broadly around them, even though, of course, they keep themselves as a separate group, which actually most of us do anyway. The problem that we have in getting more of those, and more particularly in getting travelling sites, or halting sites, as I think they've been described before, is that as councillors, we don't want to make that happen. Now, I'm not the only ex-councillor in this chamber at the moment. There are hundreds, of course, around the country. May I state the blindingly obvious again? As a local authority councillor, you do not really want to be championing a site of any kind which is seen as a bad neighbour in your area. And that's not just about people. That might be an incinerator, for example. I'm only making the comparison in planning terms. If you know that your constituents are naturally prejudiced against what it is that you're proposing, then it's very difficult to come up with a suggestion that you think it would be a good idea in your community. Now, I don't much enjoy stating the obvious, but I think at this point we just have to, because I actually have to say to the Minister in front of me right now, you have got an incredibly difficult job here, because the people whose job it is to solve the problem of accommodation are local councillors, and we know that. And yet they don't really want to do so, because as politicians it's very rarely going to be seen as being in their interests. It is going to need skills that are well beyond running Commonwealth Games, actually to get, I think running the Commonwealth Games is going to be seen as absolute walk in the park. The point is, I don't think it matters what the half of it is. I think the point is that when you're dealing with natural human prejudices, it's going to be incredibly difficult to get councils to do what they need to do. But unless the government can, working with councils, and I don't think it's just stick and carrot stuff, it's just, somehow or other, the government has got to make councils actually do what they need to do to get sites, because without that, we are going nowhere. Once that problem is solved, then I suggest, that there will be a way forward. I'd like very briefly, and I know it's going to be brief, providing off to pick up on a couple of things that Murdo Froese said. I entirely recognise the plight of the private landowner from my own experience in Stonehaven. I don't think she wants us to rehearse that on the record. But I would just make the point that, yes, maybe gypsy travellers do drop litter, but I would have to walk half a mile from my home in Brechin, as I do very frequently, to find that the roads in and out of Brechin are strewn on their borders, on their verges, with litter that is thrown out of the windows by people leaving my city. They're not travellers. They're people who happen to drive cars, have got litter, and throw it out the windows. I think actually we need to be extremely careful that whilst there are occasions when we can blame those who've been on an illegal site for litter, it's actually something we as a society, generally speaking, seem to be able to do. And again, I think we need to be very careful not to point the finger at others when a large number of us seem to be responsible for that kind of behaviour. Thank you.
Many thanks. Now call on John Finney. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank
Thank you very much indeed. I'm grateful to all the organisations who provided briefings for us, and I think that's indicative of the widespread interest there is in this situation. I'd like to talk about some traditional stopping off places and the fact that a great number of them, certainly in the Highlands and I think elsewhere, were blocked off in the 1980s to deal with a phenomenon of the time, New Age travellers. Now, many of these New Age travellers are now back working in the City of London, but the stopping off places remain blocked up. And I think there's vested interests who are keen to see that that remains. Now, I'm interested in practical solutions. There's a place for talk, there's a place for strategies. I'm interested in practical solutions. Let me say what I mean by blocked off. A handful of large boulders are placed somewhere. Now, if the Scottish Government, as it says in its response, is genuinely interested in maintaining the traditional way of life of the gypsy travellers, they'll play their part in making available some of these sites. Now, I accept that not all these sites are in public ownership, but it would seem to me that the Transport Minister could get in touch with Transport Scotland, the local authority minister could get in touch with councils, and that to me would be a wee bit more proactive than examining, as we've been promised. It would also have the benefit of showing leadership to other landowners. There's an example, a couple of examples I like to give. Bulldozed tracks cover the hills of the Highlands, and farmers have this status called permitted development. Both these planning issues are facilitated as a result of central direction. So if that can be the case, why not gypsy traveller sites, both permanent and transit? And to my mind, if that involved compulsory purchase on the part of the Scottish Government, then I would be very happy with that. Now, the local authority sites have been criticised and rightly criticised. If I talk about the location of the 3 permanent ones in Highland Council area, one is built in a rubbish tip, one's in a sand quarry and the other's in a stone quarry. And that maybe, if your house was there, if your accommodation was there, I think that would send a very clear signal to the priority that's given to you. There's an awful lot of good work going with the Gypsy Traveller community. MECOP have been mentioned. Can I mention Karen McMaster, the issue Mr McMahon mentioned about interrupted development officers with education service? Can I say that there's between 64 and 97 children in Highland Council in any given week receiving education? I say that because any needs assessment would have to recognise that the Gypsy Traveller community is not a homogenous group of people. Patterns of travel, patterns of work vary, and that would need to be taken into account. I know of a traditional stopping off site in the outskirts of Inverness. It's fenced off by a local authority. There's no mention in the local plan of new or additional Gypsy Traveller provision, and that's certainly a coveted site, coveted by the developers.
I wonder if I might ask my colleague a question.
Margaret MacDonald.
We're talking about the difficulty of assessing the needs and therefore the delivery of service for Gypsy traveller communities because they vary in size. Has anyone approached the Highland Council and said to them, how do you deal with a steady educational supply to a population that can vary between 64 and 70 odds, I think you mentioned? Has anybody asked them how they do it? Because those are tremendous difficulties for a local authority that Nigel John referred to.
John Finney.
Well, indeed, with one of the briefings, support families in accessing education, provide guidance and teaching support to schools, support a multi-agency approach to working as per the GURFIC, develop resources and deliver training. That's the sort of thing that can be done with education. And there are a number of very articulate young gypsy travellers. The issue of halting sites was mentioned by MacDonald. I thought that was interesting, considerably more interesting than I'm reliving the politics of Aberdeen City Council. But that's the sort of thing that needs to be discussed. The report that went to the government was very forceful in many respects, quite intentionally, and I think that was what was needed. We know that there's a requirement, the general duty to eliminate discrimination, and I would commend the words used by Malcolm Chisholm in relation to that. And if we're going to advance equality of opportunity for people as regards accommodation, then I would like to see a situation where, for instance, in this chamber at First Minister's question times, in addition to reeling off statistics, commendable statistics about house building, that there's mention made of provision for gypsy travellers.
Good idea.
The action plan certainly is very welcome. There is a need for elected representatives of all parties and no party to be very mindful of their words. Mention's been made of the UN rapporteur with responsibility is in Scotland. met with young Gypsy travellers, hopefully the young women from Article 12, who will have made a significant impression on the rapporteur. I don't know what impression the accommodation will have made, because I have to say that a lot of it is extremely embarrassing. So what future for these young Gypsy travellers? These young women, what prospect? Where are they going to settle? Where's their base going to be? Or does the Scottish Government want them in houses too? Because quite bizarrely, that's still said by official, and I have dealings with constituents who are Gypsy travellers, the suggestion that everything would be sorted if they were housed. So it's not all down to the Housing Minister, and I certainly welcome the issue in the tenancy agreement. But it's a message that has to go all to the Minister's colleagues that action is needed. And by action, I mean new sites, both permanent and transit, and they're needed now. Thank you.
Many thanks, and we now move to the closing speeches, and I call on Alex Johnston. Up to 6 minutes, please, Mr Johnston.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. It's been a very interesting debate, in fact, after all that shouting and screaming there was for the past 2 days on the Government's programme. It's been nice to get down to a quiet debate about a serious subject and something which this Parliament can actually deliver in conjunction with the Scottish Government. Being able to speak twice in a debate, of course, gives me the privilege of being able to say in the second attempt all the things I forgot to say in the first attempt. And one thing I forgot to do, of course, was to pay tribute to Mary Fee, the retiring convener of the Equal Opportunities Committee. I have great respect for Mary Fee, not least for the fact that the way she managed to put up with my unsophisticated right-wing attitudes and a number of things during the time we shared on the committee. In fact, of course, it was a difficult thing to chair the committee through this difficult process, and there were seriously competing views. I have to say that I think the committee did treat one or two witnesses quite badly. And I think a strong chair was important to ensure that we didn't make that mistake too often. But people like Christopher Ahern, who was the chairman of the North Muirton Community Council, and James Brownhill, who was the vice chairman of the Nigg Community Council, when they came before the committee, were treated quite robustly, although all they were doing was expressing the minority view that exists around Scotland and the view that is put directly opposite the one expressed by many of those who speak out in favour of the traditional travelling community. It also has to be said that there have been a number of things said here which I agree with and perhaps should have agreed with earlier. John Mason, for one, and both the McMahon family, for another two, did point out, of course, that when we talk about government failing to give leadership, this is not just this government that's a problem. It's been a 12-year process that we've been going through here, and it is successive governments that have failed to deliver. The truth is, however, that earlier governments, and of course this government in an earlier form, took the view that this is a subject that should be dealt with by local authorities. However, the evidence now increasingly points to the fact that local authorities are unable to achieve this through the local democratic process. And that's why strong leadership is so important. Very briefly, Dennis.
Dennis Robertson.
Thank the member for taking an intervention. Does he mean that local authorities are unwilling rather than unable?
Alex Johnson.
What I mean is not unwilling, because they are very keen to achieve this objective. What I'm saying is that they are unable to achieve this through the local democratic process. And it's a simple reason, because they go all the way down the road to producing the halting site that we all want them to produce, and then the democratic process stops it because the local councillor is unable to face up to the responsibility of delivering that in the face of local opposition. And that's why strong leadership is important. I think John Mason described it as dealing with it with more urgency, although I have to say that John Finney's speech a few moments ago, perhaps I wouldn't be quite as strong as his suggestion of going forward with compulsory purchase, because I think that may inflame the situation. However, what we have to remember is that we are dealing here with a distinctive group, a group that has been subject to discrimination, but nonetheless one that does not want to be forcibly integrated into the settled community. The Gypsy travellers are people who enjoy their privacy. We have to respect their differences, and we have to respect their independence. Above all, the Gypsy Traveller community do not like outsiders interfering in their lives. So we need to ensure that what we supply is what they require without that level of interference. There is, in avoiding the accusation of discrimination, a need for us to recognise that there is a difference, and a difference that we should respect. It's also important that we take steps to alleviate the concerns that exist within the settled community, and I believe myself and my colleague Murdo Fraser were the only two people here who talked about the presumption against prosecution. Now, as came out in the evidence in this inquiry, the presumption against prosecution that is used by ACPOS relates exclusively to unauthorised stops. And it doesn't apply to things like fly tipping, offences against the Road Traffic Act or any other offence. It is only about unauthorised stops. And there is a degree of concern that there is a lack of police integration or a lack of effort by the police to integrate the traveller community into the normal enforcement of the law. However, bringing... yes, indeed.
You've described your unsophisticated right-wing attitudes, and I wonder, it seems to be that you share Murdo Fraser's idea that camping without permission should at all times be prosecuted. You'll be aware of the fact that wild camping is a very popular recreation. Surely you're not, if you're selectively reinterpreting the law, I think you're exceeding the bounds of this Parliament.
Alec Johnston, 15 seconds.
I think we have perhaps come to the point in this debate where we can find that there will be arguments on these issues, and we have found the boundaries between which the arguments may take place. I am not critical or directly critical of the current position taken by ACPOS. What I'm trying to do at this point is reinforce the fact that the presumption against prosecution applies exclusively to unauthorised stops and does not apply to any other offence. Presiding Officer, it's important that we take this forward in a timely and a constructive way. I genuinely believe that the time has come for the Scottish Government, with the support of all others around this chamber, to show that strong leadership and deliver on behalf of the Gypsy Traveller community.
Ms Bailey, up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I welcome the opportunity to close the debate for Labour on the Equal Opportunities Committee report on where Gypsy travellers live. And can I too start by congratulating the former convener Mary Fee and indeed all members of the committee for the very comprehensive and inclusive approach that they took to arriving at their recommendations. And, like others, welcome Margaret McCulloch to her new role. She clearly has big shoes to fill. Big feet, I know, big shoes to fill. It's been a long afternoon, but Presiding Officer, as others have said, this is the third committee inquiry on the same subject and the same set of issues since the start of the Parliament, and I struggle to think of any other specific policy issue that's been the subject of 3 reports, so it's clear that there is still much need for substantial improvement, and that has been borne out by virtually every contribution this afternoon. It has been, in the main, a very helpful and consensual debate, and there is much agreement across the chamber about what needs to be done, but we all recognise that we need to move beyond that. I'm not having a pop at this government. I think this is a problem for government in general, as we must surely ask ourselves, if we all agree what needs to be done, if we highlight our concerns, if we make recommendations on some of the potential solutions, why then does something not happen? And it is a fundamental matter for all of us and for government, because there is little point in making policy decisions if they're then not carried through. So I think John Finney is right to ask what's been going on. Now, Margaret McCulloch and Mary Fee described to us all in very vivid terms the real challenges that people face. No running water, overflowing septic tanks, children bathing in ice-cold water, and no toilets, and the list goes on. We should be angry about the conditions people are living in. And members across the chamber have raised the persistent problems with ensuring that children are appropriately educated and that all members of the community have access to healthcare, which, as John Mason acknowledged, is patchy to say the least. There are 20 separate recommendations, each one raising a myriad of challenges, but let me focus on just a few. And accommodation, as I touched on a minute ago, because if the Scottish Government can deliver and prioritise on this recommendation, it will have the potential to transform lives. Minimum standards for accommodation and housing services monitored by the government are, I believe, now essential. And I acknowledge the difficulty caused by gypsy travellers pulling onto the roadside sites and the tension caused by people living in the settled community. There are regular problems in many areas across Scotland with seasonal unauthorised encampments. But if there were sufficient sites that are well serviced, this might help to make a bit of a difference. Now, we've heard from many speakers this afternoon about the difficulties that local government have in identifying sites, but also in then delivering them as actual sites. But we cannot stand back, I believe now, and leave them to do it alone. The Equality and Human Rights Commission suggested that we should adopt a regional approach that would be sensitive to traditional travelling patterns of the community. There is a clear role for the Scottish Government in brokering this. EHRC also talked about resourcing, and I remember under the previous government there was specific funding available for local authorities to establish suitably serviced sites. That money has been rolled up into the general budget allocation for local authorities, and I'm told that not one single site has been established since. And again, there is a clear role for the Scottish Government in this. I was very taken by the unusually thoughtful contribution from the unsophisticated right-wing Alex Johnson, as he will now be known. He called for leadership on this issue by the Scottish Government. No more discussion groups, but practical action instead. And I think John Mason expressed similar frustration, wanting the Government to get on with it. But I think we can also agree that we all have a part to play and stand ready to lend our support. Another powerful contribution came from Christian Allard when he talked about challenging the racism and discrimination against gypsy travellers and urging the government to move quickly. That was echoed by both Siobhan McMahon and Linda Fabiani. I did, however, note his refreshing honesty about when he joined the committee, because another politician in this chamber would have claimed parentage of the report. But the committee does deserve our thanks for considering the position of gypsy travellers. You know, I do hope they come back to this report, whether it's 6 months or 12 months or even 2 years from now, to measure progress against each of the recommendations, because maybe then, just then, we might see change. Michael McMahon's contribution and analysis was striking. And let me say, as the minister that responded to that debate all those years ago in 2001, I was younger then, presiding officer, he was right. The government was criticised, and rightly so, by the Parliament. The received wisdom at that time was that local authorities were best placed to deliver. But we actually now need to learn the lessons from that experience, because responsibility is owned by too many, so people don't feel they need to deliver on it. Local authorities, as we've heard, experience challenges in dealing with this, so we do need the Scottish Government to assume responsibility. One focus, one ministerial lead, and, presiding officer, I can't think of anyone better than Shona Robson to see progress on this issue, and if she takes up that challenge, even I will be happy to support her in taking this agenda forward. Thank you.
Many thanks. And appropriately, I now call on Shona Robson to wind up the debate on behalf of the Government. Minister, up to 8 minutes, please.
Oh, thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm almost speechless by that offer of support. It doesn't come very often, and I'll come on to that in a minute. But I think it has been a very welcome debate. Very good contributions from across the chamber, and I'll touch on a few of them as I go forward. We have, of course, heard about the many challenges and barriers faced every day by the gypsy traveller community. And as has already been identified, I, as Minister with responsibility for equality, I do have the overarching ministerial responsibility for this area of work, and I always relish a challenge, but it does provide me with the opportunity to be the glue, if you like, within government to make sure that responsibilities which lie elsewhere are happening and are actioned. The Scottish Government, of course, does recognise that the Gypsy traveller community is among the most disenfranchised and discriminated against. We see that through attitudinal surveys, which show huge progress in many other areas, but with regards to attitudes towards the Gypsy traveller community, we are seeing attitudes which have had their time. And I do welcome the opportunity to take forward this work through not just a cross-government approach, but hopefully a cross-party approach. And I think one concrete thing that could come from today's debate is to take you up on the offer of that cross-party support and leadership, because it's not just the leadership of government, it's the leadership of parliamentarians as well. And I think there is an opportunity as we move forward with the National Awareness Campaign for that kind of local ambassadors for change, if you like, to challenge some of the attitudes. So I will be coming back to people who have expressed that willingness across all of the parties to see how that might take some practical effect. And I think that's something concrete that can come from this debate. I want to turn now to some of the specifics that have been raised within this debate. I might not get through everybody's, but I'll try my best. First of all, to welcome Margaret McCulloch, of course, as the new convener. And not an easy job, just in the job for a day and having to speak on behalf of the committee, but you did a very good job. And clearly this is an issue that the committee, I think, should come back to. And it shouldn't just be a one-off report. And I think we can look at ways of how we work together to make sure that progress is monitored. I think when Margaret Burgess responded to the issue of the campaign and the awareness campaign, she mentioned that the discussions with Amnesty International and how we take this forward. I think there is a need for a clear action plan with some timeframes in terms of when matters will be taken forward. And I'm very happy to come back to the committee with some of that framed within an action plan. And I think particularly the awareness-raising campaign, we can put some timeframes to that without too much difficulty. I should also pay tribute to Mary Fee. Had Margaret Burgess been closing, she would have done so, but I'm going to do it on behalf of both of us for the work that she's already done as convener. And of course to congratulate her on her new position. I think one of the themes that has come throughout this debate is about that balance of rights and responsibilities, and that's quite a difficult one, but it is very important. And I too would join with others and say that as politicians, of course, we always do need to watch our language, but we also need to dig a bit deeper into what the issue is actually about. And you know, if you take the Dundee issue that was raised, actually when you look at what the issue was about, it was actually about poor business practice, but became an issue of ethnicity, which actually shouldn't be about ethnicity or the ethnic background of the person carrying out the work. Actually, the issue was poor business practice, and poor business practice of not providing an invoice, not providing a quote, and the ramifications of what happens when that conflict takes place on someone's doorstep when there's a dispute about what was agreed. So it's about poor business practice, not the ethnic origin of those. And I think what we need to do is to look at what the issues are. But it is about rights, and it is, of course, about responsibilities, and we've got to balance those. And I think Alec Johnson attempted to lay out some of those challenges without a doubt that when it comes to some of the challenges local councillors have had about new sites and, of course, dealing with unauthorised camps, these are, of course, issues that are going to be very difficult to resolve, but of course issues that have been identified as early priorities about how do we try to build a relationship locally. I'm not sure the answer, and I don't think Alec Johnson was suggesting this, that the Scottish Government comes in with a pair of tackety boots and says it's going to go there, because that is going to please no one and is going to solve nothing. But it is clearly about trying to replicate some of the very good practices. And we've heard again this afternoon about where sites are working well. So if they can work well in some areas, they can work well in all areas. And we need to learn from that and try to replicate that good practice. I thought Mark MacDonald made a very good contribution. He got beyond the kind of rhetoric that has been a problem for all parties. And I think something that we have to again try and provide the leadership to move people beyond some of what we might be seen as easy political hits in a local context. Siobhan McMahon, again, she asked specifically about the time frame for the awareness raising campaign. I think I can give that reassurance. I think that would be a good start. But I was struck by, I think it was Nigel Dawn's suggestion that an awareness raising campaign shouldn't be about trying to sort of explain what Gypsy Travellers are about. It's not really about that. It's about trying to respect difference, and respect difference without necessarily having to understand everything about the Gypsy Traveller community. I'm really struck by that. So I think when looking at how the awareness raising campaign goes forward, I think those ideas really need to be taken on board, and we'll look at that. I think Murdo Fraser again came back to some very big issues around unauthorised sites, and of course some of the rubbish that's left, the costs of the clean-up, that generates negative local media headlines. But some of the biggest critics of that bad practice is actually the Gypsy Traveller community themselves, because they know that it generates bad headlines, and they are very angry when that happens, because it doesn't do anything for generating good relations. Just to end on Dennis Robertson, who called for a bugle. I'm not sure if I can be a bugle, Deputy Presiding Officer, but I can make a commitment that I will work closely with the committee, work closely with those spokespeople from other parties to really make a genuine attempt to move this issue forward. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on Marco Biaggi to wind up on behalf of the committee. You have just about 9 minutes, Mr. Biaggi.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Let me begin by paying tribute to the Mary Fee with all her determination and grit, which may be code for something, I don't know, but she's certainly been very strong in the chair and has served the Equal Opportunities Committee well. And of course we have Margaret McCulloch now, who on her first effective day as convener hasn't just to lead off a debate here, but also presided very, very masterfully over the Marriage and Civil Partnership Bill, Stage 1, not in itself an easy first task. This inquiry is perhaps slightly unlike a lot of inquiries, because the process that was gone through was very extensive. We saw committee members going to sites in Edinburgh, Dalkeith, Perth, Pitlochry, Oban, Lochgilphead, and a committee meeting formally being held in Clinterty in Aberdeen. We really wanted to reach out, to try and deal with the barriers, to overcome the difficulties, and to try to deliver something that manifestly hadn't been delivered in the past. To quote on those barriers from the report, just the kind of stigma that we have and that we see from Gypsy Traveller witnesses. My wee sister has lied about her address when filling out applications for jobs, because at other times, employers who have found out her address have told her that she is not suitable. Another, if I purchase something from a shop and try to return it because it is faulty, when the person behind the counter asks for the postcode, it comes up on the computer as Gypsy Traveller person site. We cannot even use the site address to hire a DVD. That's the kind of everyday obstacle that is faced. And when you also have, as was quoted by Siobhan McMahon, evidence that 47% of the public think that Gypsy Travellers would be unsuitable as primary teachers, a figure that's barely changed since 2006, you see the extent of the problem. And this is not the first time You know, if there is one core message that has come out from the debate and from the report, it is the frustration. It's been cited by Siobhan McMahon, by John Mason, very eloquently by Linda Fabiani, whose experience of the last committee, along with Michael McMahon's, really does show that perhaps the more things change, the more they have unfortunately stayed the same. As Dennis Robertson pointed out, many Gypsy travellers who come in contact with the process are starting to ask, what's the point? And we must be incredibly careful, because hopes that are raised and dashed repeatedly do not rise again as high. So looking again back at what has changed since 2001 and has been touched on, there are one or two things that we can see as progress. For example, one of the main calls in 2001 was the clear establishment of the ethnicity status of Gypsy travellers. We now have that. Unfortunately, while that may strengthen our hand in theory, we're yet to see quite as much impact coming through. But that is progress that we can look at. Broadly, however, most of the other issues, in particular access to services, which was right through the 2001 report, remains an issue. We have recommendations from the committee that have been referred to on health, on education, on social work, on the relationships with local authority departments, though we do have what the committee considered to be a very positive example of police progress in regards to their relations with Gypsy travellers. The Scottish Government was recommended to explore how pilots and projects can be replicated, those that are very successful. One that we came into contact with in the committee, and which hasn't necessarily been talked about as much, was the North East Dialogue Day that brought people together and that we in our committee in Clinterty attempted to duplicate. Because it's important to have that link. The old cliche of nothing about us without us really does apply in a community like this that are so distanced from statutory authorities in many cases simply because of disillusionment. So we get to the main ways forward that have been talked about. Broadly, there are three categories: site quantity, site quality and leadership. Site quantity is a major issue feeding into the requirement for Gypsy travellers to use informal sites to stop. This was pointed out by John Finney, who reeled off the story of the blocked-off traditional stopping places that are all across the Highlands. Now, we've actually heard differences of opinion on the alternative of transit sites, short-stay, formal encampments. We've heard some Gypsy travellers that would support them, others that would not want to make use of them, which shows that we do have to have that involvement. But we must be careful that the solution of temporary sites is not seen through the lens of simply the needs of the settled community or getting rid of a problem. In that regard, I would be cautious about defining Gypsy travellers as opposed to ordinary people, or using language like innocent victims. At the time of the report, there were 28 all-year sites operational throughout Scotland. One study alone in one region of Scotland suggested that 35 additional sites would be needed in that area to deal with the demand. This has come up, but also the quality. You know, Malcolm Chisholm said that decent housing is a basic human right. We need to remember that. We've seen firsthand, the committee in visiting, the kind of standards that are being endured on a day-to-day basis. There are, however, good sites. Let us single them out. Perth is always cited as being the top quality place. But again, while that always happens from experts, from observers, we've heard some people in the Gypsy traveller community suggesting that Perth is too close to becoming a settled community. And again, the sensitivities of the people we try to help needs to be considered. Standard tenancy would be a start. Amnesty established a model post-2001. The last time they surveyed, only 3 local authorities had introduced it. The recommendations, the other recommendations, mainly surround leadership, and leadership has been the dominant theme today. Leadership has been a difficult balance for the committee. John Mason was right to point to paragraph 49 in the very carefully chosen language, and we've seen a slight range of perspectives here. You have people who believe in a strong role for government, for central government, those who believe in a role for government more broadly, with the importance of local government Both the stories of Nigel Dawn and Mark MacDonald, from the coalface, if you like, of local government, emphasise the importance of bringing the local community with you. A local councillor who can't overcome that barrier in that mental block that many settled communities will have is going to have difficulties in trying to support the introduction of a new transit site or a new permanent site. Unfortunately, that difficulty is only going to be exacerbated if someone comes in on a white charger and makes it worse. The point about supporting the development of sites is that everyone has to face up to their responsibility, local and national government, because there is clearly a role for national government. It is fair to say that we would not tolerate at local decision-making level the kind of derogation of responsibility that we have perhaps seen. And the transient nature in particular, the mobile nature of the gypsy traveller community requires a degree of standardisation, in particular in access to services. There is one NHS across Scotland. The local authorities are not going to be able to be decision makers for that. And in that regard, the example that's been given by the police is a welcome one. I was disturbed by COSLA's response. The committee was disturbed. Christian Allard mentioned it. Others mentioned it. And I think it is important that COSLA is brought with us on this, because we would all struggle to live a life according to our values and traditions if we faced the same obstacles that gypsy travellers are facing. The committee has received the response of the Scottish Government, and I believe that action can only come from the kind of steps that have been set out, but I do believe that inaction could also come because inaction came from these steps 12, 13 years ago when similar promises were given. So we will be watching as a committee. We will be scrutinising what the government is doing, about how the ministerial mainstreaming is working, the development of this campaign with Amnesty, the updates of site provision, potentially the exploring of a standard gypsy traveller tenancy agreement. While I'm sure we would all have welcomed much more concrete and immediate commitments, we will be watching to make sure that these do turn into concrete actions this time. Because if this Parliament is to mean anything, it is when a committee across parties sounds the alarm that the government, that all the agencies, all the authorities then take action.
Many, many thanks. And that concludes the Equal Opportunity Committee's debate on where gypsy travellers live. And it's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of motion number 7209 in the name of Dave Thompson on the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee report on the draft code of practice for ministerial appointments to public bodies in Scotland. And I now call on Helen Eadie to speak to and move the motion in the name of Dave Thompson on behalf of the committee. Ms. Eadie.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And unfortunately, Dave Thompson is unable to be here today. As Deputy Convener of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee, I am standing in for him. The draft Code of Practice for Ministerial Appointments to Public Bodies was laid before the Parliament by the Commissioner for Ethical Standards in Public Life on the 20th of May 2013. It was formally submitted to the Scottish Ministers and the Parliament under Section 2.4 of the Public Appointments and Public Bodies, etc. Scotland Act 2003. This section requires the Commissioner to consult the Parliament and the Scottish Ministers on the draft code. We took evidence from the Commissioner on the code on the 6th of June and published our report on the 26th of June. To summarise, our report welcomes the Commissioner's intention in the code of making the appointment system more effective, cost-efficient and attractive to potential applicants by ensuring the processes are more straightforward and proportionate and reduce bureaucracy. We believe that simplifying the processes in this way will lead to there being a wider range of applicants for appointments. That said, the committee is keen to ensure that the crucial scrutiny role which the Commissioner performs is not watered down as a result of the changes to the code. And we have made this clear in our report, whilst welcoming assurances given by the Commissioner that this is not the purpose of the code. The report also welcomes the fact that the Commissioner has added diversity to the overarching principles of the Code. This is a positive and progressive step. Overall, the report makes a number of recommendations for the Commissioner. We encourage the Commissioner to take full account of the findings of the report when finalising the Code over the next few weeks. The Committee welcomes the Code and commands the Commissioner on developing a simplified yet robust document. We look forward to the publication of the final Code. I ask the Parliament this evening to endorse the Committee's report as its formal response to the Commissioner and move motion S4M 07209 in the name of Dave Thompson on behalf of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
And thank you. And the question on this motion will be put at decision time. And the next item of business is consideration of motion number 7573 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon on the High Speed Rail Preparation Bill UK legislation. And I call on Nicola Sturgeon to move the motion. Cabinet Secretary.
Formally moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And the question on this motion will be put at decision time. And the next item of business is consideration of motion number 7576 in the name of Christine Graham on the proposal for European legislation motion of the Justice Committee. I'd invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Christine Graham to speak to and move the motion on behalf of the committee. Ms Graham, up to 5 minutes, please.
As I heard a groan from my colleague Colin Keir, MSP, I'll try not to use up the 5 minutes, hadn't even started. Can I say the Justice Committee is breaking new ground today? We're that kind of committee. This is the first time that the committee has brought a motion to the Chamber on a breach of the subsidiarity principle. But before I get into the nuts and bolts of it, I'd like to comment on the timescale for consideration of EU legislative proposals. The committee had one meeting in which to consider and take a decision on what is an extremely complex proposal, which could have had serious ramifications for the Scottish criminal justice system. It was fortuitous that the Cabinet Secretary was able to come along at very short notice, I thank him for that, to our meeting to assist us in our scrutiny. I understand that the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee will in due course be looking into the handling of EU legislative proposals which raise subsidiarity concerns, and I make a plea, and I'm sure other conveners probably feel the same, that committee examine the timescales for scrutiny of its inquiry. It's late in the day, so I won't go into the details, but for those who don't have an in-depth knowledge of EU matters, the subsidiarity principle is that unless the EU has exclusive competence, action should be taken at the lowest level of governance, consistent with the subject matter and objective. This proposal that was before us would establish a new body, a European Public Prosecutor's Office, to tackle EU fraud. The motivation for this was, in fact, EU fraud from the Union. The Commission has identified that suspected EU fraud amounts to around 425 million a year, but suggests that the actual amount, I think we'd agree, could be much higher. The Commission believes that Member States are not able to identify, investigate and prosecute EU fraud effectively, and therefore that a European Public Prosecutor's Office operating on a supranational basis was needed to protect the EU's financial interests. I should say at this point, in fairness, that the UK Government does not intend to participate in this proposal, and therefore it will not affect the UK directly. That said, the precedent it may set in establishing a supranational body dealing with criminal matters such as this was in itself worrying. The EPPO would have had exclusive competence to investigate, prosecute and bring to judgment those connected to offences against the EU's financial interests. We understand that this power could also be extended to include other related offences, given that the EPPO would be able to direct investigative activity at national level, a Scottish level, and not just in relation to EU fraud offences. The committee unanimously was very concerned that the EPPO would cut across the role of the Lord Advocate as head of the prosecution system in Scotland, Our EU reporter, Roderick Campbell, handy to my right, will explore this and other issues in a little more detail. In conclusion, we agreed with the Scottish Government that EU fraud could be tackled effectively at member state level. Indeed, this appears to be the case in the UK, and we also agreed that the Commission has not made a strong enough case for EU action. The committee therefore agreed that the EU legislative proposal to establish an EPPO does not comply with the subsidiarity principle as set out in Article 5 of the Treaty of European Union. I therefore move motion S4M 7576 on behalf of the Justice Committee.
I call on Rod Campbell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As the EU Rapporteur for the Justice Committee, I would like to add a few comments to those of the convener of that committee. Although our remit is subsidiarity alone, it's perhaps worth saying it's often difficult to distinguish between matters of subsidiarity and proportionality. I plan to explore in a little more detail in the time available some of the evidence we gathered that led to our decision. The UK Government was particularly concerned at the lack of robust evidence from the European Commission to justify the creation of an EPPO with rules of evidence that will apply across the board in all Member States, working across the whole Union and in all Member States, and we would echo this concern. We also heard from the Cabinet Secretary that there was no evidence that the Commission had examined other alternatives to establishing the EPPO, such as providing support to Member States to improve their effectiveness in tackling EU fraud. As the convener has said, recorded fraud amounts to about 0.5% of the European budget, or between £400 to £600 million. Scottish Government officials told us that currently there is only one case of EU fraud in Scotland and around 25 in the UK as a whole, which suggested to the committee that the EPPO proposal was very much a case of a sledgehammer being used to crack a nut. We were concerned that the EPPO would apply one-size-fits-all rules of evidence to Member States that have their own legal systems. In Scotland's case, we have our own legal system, although we are not a Member State, and that there it could create difficulties in relation to the direction and operation of investigations carried out by the police and other law enforcement agencies. In addition, this one-size-fits-all approach would apply to Scotland.
I need to ask you to start winding up, Mr Campbell.
Indeed, without any evidence that the Scottish or indeed legal systems elsewhere in the UK were defective. In closing, therefore, the committee, in examining the evidence, was unanimous in its decision that the proposal does not comply with the principle of subsidiarity and would urge the Chamber to endorse that view. Thank you.
The question on this motion will be put at decision time. A point of order from Mary Scanlon.
Conduct for MSPs, section 7.3.1, conduct in the Chamber or in committee which requires that members shall at all times conduct themselves in a courteous and respectful manner. Earlier today, the First Minister responded to the leader of the Labour Party, and I quote, "I know that Johann Lamont and the Conservatives are welded together in the Better Together campaign, but her quoting a Conservative MSP as definite proof really is evidence that the rest of Scotland would find tame and insubstantial. Presiding Officer, the comments referred to were made by me, as I stood in for the Labour Party chair at this week's proceedings of the Public Audit Committee. Standing orders state that no member who represents a political party which is represented in the Scottish Government may be convener of the committee. Therefore, as Deputy Convener, I convened this week's proceedings. The remit of the Public Audit Committee is to consider and report on financial control, accounting and auditing in relation to public expenditure and, I quote, to hold to account those in government tasked with spending money. In June, the previous convener, Ian Gray, wrote on behalf of all members of the committee to the Permanent Secretary and the Principal Accountable Officer for the Scottish Government, Sir Peter Housden, to ask several questions to assist the committee to do the job it is tasked to do. I did not consider the Permanent Secretary's responses adequate, stating that he would speak with ministers, he would carry out reviews and consultations, and that he would reflect how best to respond. In truth, he did not answer the questions put to him, and, Presiding Officer, I stand by what I said. I was fulfilling my duties as a parliamentarian and a member of the Audit Committee of this Parliament. I do not think it was courteous or respectful for the First Minister to dismiss my comments in such a manner. whatever side of the political or constitutional debate members of this Parliament are on, can I ask that the views of every MSP must be responded to in a courteous and respectful manner as we carry out our parliamentary duties on behalf of the people of Scotland. If the First Minister wants definite proof of the inadequate and insulting answers given by the Permanent Secretary, they are available as committee papers. So finally, Presiding Officer, I find it very insulting, discourteous and disrespectful to refer to any Member of Parliament's comments as rather tame and insubstantial. I seek your response on this matter.
A point of order from James Dornan.
I was part of the committee that Mrs Scanlon was speaking on, and I have to be honest with you, this is not something I like to raise in here, but her comments were so rude that I had to disassociate myself from them at the first opportunity at the committee. Respect, I agree with Mrs Scanlon, respect is very important. It should also be given to witnesses as well as to members of this chamber.
Can I say to members I'm not prepared to have a rerun of the Public Audit Committee. I think anybody who wants to see what happened at the Public Audit Committee could read the official report. Kenneth MacDosh, do you have a point of order?
Yes, Presiding Officer. I'd like to further to the two previous points of order. As a new member of this committee, can I suggest that the convener was not in the slightest bit disrespectful or discourteous? Ms Scanlon is known to all members of this Parliament, all members, as always courteous and respectful to all MSPs, and is certainly not.
Mr McIntosh, I've already said that I'm not going to have a rerun of the Public Audit Committee. Can you resume your seat? It's not a point of order and your microphone has shut down. Can I thank the member for advance notice of her point of order? I appreciate that the member feels strongly about this, but my view is that this is part of parliamentary debate and is not a breach of standing orders. We now move to decision time. There are 3 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that motion 7209 in the name of Dave Thompson and the draft code of practice for ministerial appointments be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 7573 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon on high-speed rail preparation bill UK legislation be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 7576 in the name of Christian Graham on the proposal of European legislation be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time, and I now close this meeting.